Good evening, and welcome back to Midnight Murder and Mystery. Sorry it took so long to upload. I've been spending a lot of time trying to research this case, and it has been long work because the case we're going to be talking about today, the Sewol Ferry tragedy, is such a detailed case. There are so many different factors that resulted in this case being the tragedy it's known as today. So many different stories that need to be told and need to be heard. That being said, it would be really appreciated if you like the video, and if you like this sort of content, maybe consider subscribing. I am hoping to have a more consistent upload schedule, but some cases such as this one require a lot of research to make sure I get all the details correct, because these people's stories deserve to be told properly. On April 15, 2014, hundreds of students boarded the Sewol Ferry for what should have been an exciting school trip to Jeju Island. They laughed with friends, settled into their cabins, and looked forward to the days ahead. Less than 24 hours later, many of them would be dead. The Sewol Ferry disaster would become one of South Korea's darkest tragedies, not only because the ferry sank, but because so many lives may have been saved. As passengers waited for rescue, they were repeatedly told to stay where they were. Parents received desperate phone calls and final messages from their children. Meanwhile, confusion, delays, and unanswered questions unfolded around them. More than a decade later, the disaster continues to haunt South Korea. Tonight, we're going to examine exactly what happened aboard the Sewol, the failures that turned an emergency into a catastrophe, and why so many families are still searching for answers. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's begin. Years after the Sewol Ferry tragedy, one civilian diver was asked if there was a single moment from the recovery operation that he could never forget. It was a difficult question to answer. He had spent months diving into the wreck, squeezing through collapsed corridors and flooded cabins while searching for victims. He had witnessed scenes that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Yet whenever people asked him about the experience, his mind always returned to the same discovery. It involved two 16-year-old students from Danwon High School. In the years that followed the tragedy, rumors began circulating about who they were to each other. Some people believed they had been dating, while others claimed they were close friends. Classmates who knew both students would later dismiss those stories, saying the pair barely knew one another at all. Some students couldn't even remember them sharing a class together. Under normal circumstances, they might have spent their entire lives as little more than familiar faces, occasionally passing each other in a hallway without exchanging more than a few words. But on the morning of April 16, 2014, normal circumstances no longer existed. Somewhere inside the Sewol, as the ferry slowly rolled onto its side and water began flooding through the vessel, those two students found themselves trapped together in a room deep within the ship. Nobody knows exactly what happened during those final moments. Nobody knows what they talked about, whether they tried to comfort one another, whether they spoke about their families waiting for them back home, or whether they sat together in silence listening to the sounds of the ship around them. The only people who knew what happened in that room never lived to tell the story. When divers eventually entered the wreck and reached the cabin, they found the two students together. The cords from their life jackets had been tied to one another, joining them in a way that suggested a simple but heartbreaking decision had been made. Whether they knew each other well or barely at all no longer mattered. Faced with fear, uncertainty, and the growing realization that help might never arrive, neither wanted to face those final moments alone. The diver, who found them, would later admit that he cried. He knew he couldn't bring both bodies to the surface at the same time. The conditions inside the wreck made that impossible. As difficult as it was, he had to untie the cords connecting them so that he could recover them one at a time. Even years later, he could still remember that moment with painful clarity. Out of everything he had witnessed inside the Sewol, it was the memory that stayed with him the longest. He later said that separating them felt wrong, as though he was breaking a promise they had made to each other in their final moments. But he knew there was no other choice. Their story would come to symbolize the unimaginable fear, experienced by so many aboard the Sewol that morning. What had begun as an ordinary school trip to Jeju Island ended in one of the deadliest maritime disasters in modern South Korean history. Of the 476 people aboard the ferry, only 172 survived. The remaining 304 victims included 250 students from Danwon High School, young people who had boarded the vessel the previous evening, believing they were heading toward a few days of adventure with their friends. For the families left behind, the tragedy became a wound that never truly healed. For South Korea, it became a national trauma that exposed failures, incompetence, and unanswered questions that would spark years of grief, anger, and investigation. Even now, more than a decade later, the mention of the Sewol Ferry still evokes powerful emotions across the country, because for many people, it represents far more than a maritime disaster. It represents a moment when trust was broken, when hundreds of lives were lost, and when countless families were left searching for answers. To understand how it happened, we have to go back to the beginning. Back to a foggy evening at Incheon Port, where hundreds of excited students boarded a ferry bound for Jeju Island, completely unaware that the journey they were about to begin would change South Korea forever. If you had walked through Incheon Port on the afternoon of April 15th, 2014, you would have seen hundreds of excited teenagers gathered with their suitcases and backpacks, laughing with friends and taking photos while they waited to board the ferry that would take them to Jeju Island. For the sophomore students of Danwon High School, this wasn't just another school trip. It was something they had been looking forward to for months. Jeju Island was one of the most popular holiday destinations in South Korea, famous for its beaches, scenery, and attractions. And for many of the students, it would be their first time visiting without their parents. That freedom was a huge part of the excitement. Instead of spending the next few days sitting in classrooms, worrying about homework and exams, they would be traveling with their friends, making memories they expected to talk about for years. Even when heavy fog rolled into the area and delayed the ferry's departure by more than 2 hours, nobody seemed particularly bothered. Normally, a delay like that would have frustrated a group of teenagers eager to start their holiday, but the mood at the port remained upbeat. Friends sat together chatting, taking photographs, and sending messages home while they waited. If anything, the delay only seemed to build anticipation for the journey ahead. As evening approached, passengers finally began boarding the Sewol. To many of the students, the ferry felt enormous. It had cabins with bunk beds, restaurants, lounges, communal showers, and even a convenience store. Spending the night aboard almost felt like part of the holiday itself. By the time boarding was complete, there were 476 people on board, including 325 students from Danwon High School, 14 teachers, 29 crew members, and dozens of other passengers traveling to Jeju for work or vacation. When the ferry finally left Incheon Port at around 9 p.m., excitement spread throughout the ship. Students gathered on deck to watch the city lights disappear into the distance, while others explored the vessel with their friends. Phones were constantly in use as photos were shared online and messages were sent back home. Parents received updates, letting them know their children had boarded safely and that the trip was finally underway. As the night went on, the atmosphere aboard the Sewol remained relaxed and cheerful. Groups of students wandered through the corridors, talked in each other's cabins, and discussed everything they planned to do once they reached Jeju Island. For many of them, this was their first real taste of independence, and they were determined to enjoy every minute of it. Later that evening, passengers gathered outside as fireworks lit up the night sky above the ferry. Students watched from the deck while taking photographs of the colorful bursts overhead, completely unaware that some of those pictures would later become the last images ever taken of them. Looking back now, what stands out most is how normal everything seemed. There were no signs of fear, no indication that anything was wrong, and no reason for anyone on board to believe that by the following days, the Sewol would be lying at the bottom of the sea. Eventually, the excitement of the day began to catch up with everyone. Students drifted back to their cabins, some staying awake talking with friends, while others sent one final message home before going to sleep. The boys settled into rooms on the third floor of the vessel, the girls on the second, and before long, the noise that had filled the ferry throughout the evening gradually faded away. Outside, the Sewol continued south through calm waters as hundreds of passengers slept peacefully in their beds. Most expected to wake up the next morning, have breakfast, and continue their journey toward Jeju Island. None of them could have imagined that when the sun rose on April 16th, they would find themselves caught in one of the deadliest maritime disasters in modern history. The morning of April 16, 2014, began like any other morning aboard the Sewol. As the ferry continued its journey south toward Jeju Island, most of the passengers were still asleep in their cabins. The excitement and energy that had filled the ship the night before had finally given way to exhaustion, and after hours of laughing, talking, and exploring the vessel, many of the students were enjoying a few extra hours of sleep before arriving at their destination. Outside, the sea appeared calm. The Sewol had traveled through the night without incident, and there was little reason for anyone on board to believe that anything was wrong. The trip was running as expected, and by late morning the ferry was supposed to arrive at Jeju Island, where hundreds of excited students would begin what they hoped would be one of the most memorable experiences of their school years. While most passengers slept, the crew continued working as normal. At around 7:30 that morning, a routine shift change took place on the bridge of the ferry. The overnight crew handed over responsibilities to a new team, allowing those who had worked through the night to finally get some rest. Among those taking over were helmsman Cho, who would be responsible for steering the vessel, and third mate Park, who was supervising operations on the bridge. Nothing about the shift change seemed unusual. It was a standard part of operating a passenger ferry, something that had happened countless times before. Captain Lee Jun-suk was not on the bridge at the time. His shift had ended, and he was resting in his private cabin elsewhere on the ship. Like many of the passengers, he likely expected the remainder of the journey to be uneventful. As the morning continued, activity slowly began picking up around the ferry. At approximately 8 a.m., breakfast was served in the cafeteria. Some passengers had already woken up and made their way there to eat, while others remained in their cabins, either sleeping or getting ready for the day ahead. For the students who were awake, the mood remained cheerful. Jeju Island was getting closer with every passing hour, and many were already discussing their plans for the trip. The atmosphere aboard the ship was relaxed, with little indication that disaster was quietly approaching. At around 8:20 a.m., the Sewol's autopilot system was disengaged, and manual steering was activated. Again, this was not unusual. Ferries often switched between automated and manual navigation, depending on the conditions and the area through which they were traveling. Just a few minutes later, the vessel entered the Mangol Channel. Most passengers had never heard of the channel before, and even if they had, few would have given it much thought. To them, it was simply another stretch of water on the journey to Jeju Island. For experienced mariners, however, the Mangol Channel had a reputation. Located off the southwestern coast of South Korea, the channel was known for its powerful and unpredictable currents. Conditions there could change rapidly, and navigating through the area required careful attention. Although many vessels used the route successfully, it was not considered the easiest passage through the region. Still, on this particular morning, the conditions appeared relatively calm. The sea was not rough. There were no towering waves. There was no storm on the horizon. From the perspective of the passengers, it was just another peaceful morning at sea. CCTV footage from that morning would later become some of the most haunting evidence connected to the disaster, not because it captured anything alarming, but because it captured the exact opposite. Students could be seen wandering through the corridors, talking with friends and preparing for the day ahead, while truck drivers stood on deck chatting amongst themselves and crew members carried out their normal duties. Some of the students who had stayed up late watching fireworks the night before were only just beginning to wake up, rubbing the sleep from their eyes and getting ready for another day of what they believed was going to be an unforgettable school trip. Looking back now, there is something heartbreaking about how ordinary it all appears. Nobody seems concerned, nobody appears frightened, and nobody has any reason to believe that anything is wrong. It looks exactly like what it was supposed to be. A normal morning aboard a passenger ferry carrying hundreds of excited teenagers toward a holiday destination. As the Sewol continued through the Mangal Channel, breakfast was being served, conversations filled the ship, and life carried on as normal. The students who were awake were thinking about Jeju Island, not safety procedures. Teachers were preparing for the day ahead, not emergency evacuations. Even the passengers traveling for work had little reason to pay attention to the route the ferry was taking. The sea appeared calm, the weather was cooperative, and there was nothing visible from the passenger decks to suggest that disaster was only minutes away. What nobody aboard the Sewol could see was that a series of decisions had already been made that would soon place the ferry in a situation from which it could not recover. At approximately 8:49 a.m., the ordinary morning aboard the Sewol came to an end. On the bridge, a decision was about to be made that would trigger a catastrophic chain of events. As the Sewol traveled through the Mangal Channel under manual steering, helmsman Cho and third mate Park initiated a turn to port, directing the ferry approximately 15 degrees to the left. On paper, a turn like that may not sound dramatic. Passenger vessels make course corrections all the time, and most passengers aboard would never have noticed the difference under normal circumstances. The problem was that the Sewol was not operating under normal circumstances. The ferry had been overloaded with cargo far beyond what it was designed to safely carry. Vehicles, shipping containers, and other freight filled the lower decks, generating the majority of the company's profit on every voyage. Even more alarming was the fact that much of that cargo had not been properly secured. The crew knew this. The company knew this. It was also well understood among those familiar with the vessel that sharp turns could be dangerous because of the ferry's unusual weight distribution. In practical terms, the Sewol had become a floating balancing act, carrying far more cargo than it should, while relying on conditions remaining stable enough to avoid exposing its weaknesses. For that reason, crew members were generally expected to make only gentle course adjustments. Yet on this morning, the ferry was turned far more aggressively than conditions safely allowed. The moment the vessel began its turn, gravity took over. Hundreds of tons of unsecured cargo shifted across the lower decks. Cars rolled, containers lurched. Heavy freight slammed violently toward one side of the ship. What had been spread across the ferry moments earlier suddenly became concentrated in a single direction, creating a force that the vessel was never designed to absorb. Passengers throughout the ship immediately felt something change. At first, it may have seemed like an unusually sharp movement, the kind of sudden lurch that makes people pause and look up from whatever they're doing. Cups slid across tables, loose objects shifted, people instinctively reached for handrails or walls to steady themselves. For a brief moment, many probably assumed the ferry would correct itself just as ships are designed to do, but it didn't. Instead, the angle continued increasing. The Sewol began listing heavily to port, leaning further and further onto its left side as the weight of the shifted cargo pulled against the vessel's stability. Throughout the ship, confusion started spreading. Passengers who had been sitting comfortably suddenly found themselves struggling to remain upright. Items began falling from shelves, chairs slid across floors. In cabins, belongings tumbled from bunks and tables as the angle became impossible to ignore. The most unsettling part was how quickly normality disappeared. Only minutes earlier, students had been thinking about breakfast and sightseeing. Now they were looking at each other with growing uncertainty, trying to understand why the floor beneath them no longer felt level. Some laughed nervously, believing it was a temporary problem. Others began asking questions. Was the ferry turning? Had it hit something? Was this normal? Nobody seemed to have any answers. As the list worsened, the ship's engines were shut down. Deep within the vessel, systems that had quietly powered the journey suddenly fell silent. For passengers, it was another sign that something was seriously wrong. The ferry was no longer simply leaning, it was losing its ability to function normally. Elsewhere aboard the ship, Captain Lee Jun-suk was still off duty in his private cabin when the situation began unfolding. Reports of the sudden list quickly reached him, and he rushed toward the bridge to assess what was happening. By the time he arrived, however, the situation was already spiraling beyond what anyone on board seemed prepared to handle. The ferry continued leaning. The cargo continued pressing against one side. Many of the passengers still didn't understand the danger they were in. Most had never experienced a maritime emergency before, and naturally assumed the crew would resolve whatever problem had occurred. After all, this was a passenger ferry operated by professionals. Surely there were procedures for something like this. Surely somebody knew what to do. Within minutes, the confusion spreading through the ferry would give way to fear. The passengers who were merely asking questions would soon be searching for answers. And all across the Sewol, hundreds of people would begin looking to the crew for guidance, trusting that the adults responsible for their safety knew exactly what needed to happen next. That trust would soon be tested in ways nobody aboard the ferry could have imagined. As passengers struggled to understand why the Sewol was leaning so heavily to one side, the truth was that the ferry's fate had likely been sealed long before it ever entered the Mangul Channel that morning. To the people aboard the vessel, the sudden list felt unexpected and confusing. Ships were designed to handle rough seas, sharp turns, and changing conditions. Most passengers naturally assumed that whatever had caused the ferry to lean would soon correct itself. After all, large vessels didn't simply roll over because of a single turn. At least, they weren't supposed to. The problem was that the Sewol had spent years accumulating problems that had quietly transformed it into something far more dangerous than it appeared from the outside. By the time it left Incheon port on April 15th, many of the safeguards that should have protected the vessel had either been weakened, ignored, or deliberately sacrificed in pursuit of profit. One of the most important of those safeguards involves something most passengers had probably never heard of: ballast water. Every large ship relies on ballast water to remain stable. Deep within the lower sections of a vessel are compartments designed to hold thousands of tons of water. This water serves a critical purpose. It lowers the ship's center of gravity and helps keep the vessel balanced when it encounters waves, strong currents, or sudden movements. When a ship begins leaning in one direction, the ballast system helps counteract that movement, allowing the vessel to gradually return to a stable position. A useful way to think about it is as a giant weight placed at the bottom of the ship. The heavier the lower portion of the vessel is, the more difficult it becomes for the upper portion to pull it over. It is one of the basic principles that allows massive passenger ferries to travel safely across the ocean. The Sewol, however, was not carrying the amount of ballast water it should have been carrying. Investigators would later discover that the vessel had been operating with only a fraction of the ballast water required for a ship of its size and cargo load. Instead of carrying over 2,000 tons, the ferry had approximately 580 tons on board. The reason was simple and deeply troubling. Ballast water occupied space and added weight, both of which limited how much cargo a company could transport for profit. By reducing the ballast water, more room became available for cargo. More cargo meant more money. Unfortunately, it also meant less stability. That alone would have been concerning, but it was only one part of a much larger problem. The Sewol was originally built in Japan before being purchased and modified by its South Korean owners. Rather than leaving the vessel in its original configuration, extensive renovations were carried out to increase the ferry's passenger capacity. Additional passenger cabins were added, new facilities were installed, and extra levels were built onto the upper sections of the ship. From a business perspective, the modifications made sense. More passenger space meant more ticket sales. More amenities meant a more attractive ferry. From a stability perspective, however, the changes created a serious problem. Every addition placed more weight higher up on the vessel. Imagine trying to balance a broom upright on your hand. The more weight you add to the top, the more unstable it becomes. Ships operate according to the same basic principle. Their weight should remain concentrated as low as possible. By adding new structures and increasing the weight above the waterline, the Sewol's center of gravity was gradually pushed higher and higher. At the same time, the amount of ballast water being carried below deck was reduced. One change raised the center of gravity, the other removed weight from the bottom. Together, they created a vessel that was far less stable than it should have been. Then there was the cargo. The Sewol generated most of its revenue not from passengers but from freight. Trucks, vehicles, containers, and commercial goods were loaded onto the vessel during almost every journey. Investigators would later determine that on the morning of the disaster, the ferry was carrying significantly more cargo than regulations allowed. Even more alarming was the condition in which that cargo had been loaded. Many of the vehicles and containers had not been properly secured. The chains, restraints, and securing systems designed to prevent movement were either inadequate or absent altogether. In effect, hundreds of tons of weight were sitting inside the vessel, with the ability to move whenever sufficient force was applied. Under normal conditions, that might not immediately cause a problem, but if the ferry suddenly leaned, everything could shift. And once that weight began moving, it would generate forces powerful enough to affect the stability of the entire ship. There was another issue lurking beneath the surface as well. The Sewol's ballast system relied on pumps that could transfer water between compartments to help counteract changes in balance. These systems were designed to assist the vessel when it began listing, helping redistribute weight and restore stability. Investigators later found evidence suggesting that critical components of this system were either inadequate, poorly maintained, or incapable of compensating for the extreme conditions created by the cargo shift. Even if the crew had reacted perfectly, there was a growing question of whether the ferry was physically capable of recovering from what had already happened. The more investigators examined the vessel after the disaster, the clearer the picture became. The Sewol had not been defeated by a single mistake. It had been weakened by years of decisions that prioritized profit over safety. Every modification, every overloaded trip, every shortcut, and every ignored warning had added another crack to the foundation. Passengers boarding the ferry had no way of knowing any of this. They saw a passenger vessel carrying students to Jeju Island. They trusted that it had been inspected. They trusted that it met safety standards. They trusted that if something went wrong, the ship was designed to protect them. What they didn't know was that many of those protections had already been compromised long before they ever stepped on board. So when the ferry made its sudden turn and hundreds of tons of unsecured cargo slammed violently toward one side of the ship, the Sewol responded exactly as physics said it would. The vessel leaned. The weight shifted, the balance was lost. And because so many of the safeguards that should have prevented disaster had already been stripped away, the ferry found itself trapped in a situation from which it was increasingly unlikely to recover. While passengers searched for answers and crew members tried to understand what was happening, the clock was already ticking. The disaster was no longer a possibility. It was happening whether they wanted it or not. As the Sewol continued leaning further onto its side, confusion slowly began turning into concern. Throughout the ferry, passengers were struggling to understand what was happening. Furniture was sliding across floors, belongings were tumbling from shelves, and moving around the ship was becoming increasingly difficult. Yet despite the growing sense that something was seriously wrong, most people still believed the situation was under control. Ferries were operated by trained professionals, and surely if there was a genuine emergency, somebody would tell them what to do. Instead, the messages they were hearing suggested the exact opposite. Over the ship's public address system, announcements began echoing through the corridors and passenger cabins. Again and again, passengers were instructed to remain where they were. They were told it was dangerous to move around the vessel and that they should stay put until further instructions were given. To many passengers, especially the students from Danwon High School, these announcements sounded reassuring. If the crew were giving instructions, then the crew must know what was happening. The safest thing to do was to listen. That trust would become one of the most tragic elements of the entire disaster. While passengers remained in their cabins following the instructions they had been given, one student realized the situation was becoming far more serious than many people around him seemed to understand. His name was Choi Daka, a student aboard the Sewol, who would later become known as the first person to place an emergency call about the sinking ferry. At approximately 8:52 a.m., only minutes after the vessel had begun listing, Choi contacted emergency services. During the call, he explained that the ferry was leaning heavily and appeared to be capsizing. Water was beginning to enter parts of the vessel, and he could tell that the situation was becoming dangerous. While many adults aboard the ship were still trying to assess what was happening, a 16-year-old student had already recognized that help was needed. The call would prove crucial because it immediately alerted authorities that something serious was unfolding at sea. Yet what makes Choi's actions even more remarkable is that while many other students would spend their final moments contacting family members, he spent those critical minutes trying to provide emergency responders with information that could help save lives. His parents would later learn that while other students were sending goodbye messages home, their son had been speaking with emergency services, trying to explain where the ferry was and what was happening aboard. As Choi was making that call, crew members aboard the Sewol were also reaching out for help. The problem was that there seemed to be no clear system for who should be contacted first or who was ultimately responsible for coordinating a response. Calls were made to vessel traffic services, Coast Guard stations, fire departments, company executives, and various emergency agencies. Information was flowing in multiple directions at once, but there appeared to be very little coordination. Valuable minutes were slipping away. All different organizations attempted to understand the scale of the emergency. By around 9:07 a.m., the crew formally informed authorities that the ferry was in serious trouble and in danger of capsizing. Communication with the Coast Guard became increasingly urgent as the angle of the vessel continued worsening. During one exchange, crew members explained that evacuation was difficult because of the severe list. They warned that the ferry could soon roll over completely. The Coast Guard responded with what seemed like a straightforward instruction. If there were passengers aboard, they needed to be told to put on life jackets and prepare for evacuation. It should have been a simple request. Instead, it became one of the most controversial moments of the disaster. A crew member informed the Coast Guard that the public address system was not functioning properly. According to him, they were unable to broadcast instructions to passengers. A statement immediately created a problem because passengers throughout the ferry could still hear announcements coming through the speakers. Those announcements were working well enough to repeatedly instruct everyone to stay where they were. The Coast Guard, unaware of this contradiction, told the crew that if the announcement system was unavailable, they would need to physically go and inform passengers themselves. The response from the crew member was immediate. He assured authorities that he would personally make sure passengers were told to put on their life jackets and prepare accordingly. But that isn't what happened. Investigations would later reveal that after making that promise, the crew member did not move through the passenger areas, informing people of the danger. Instead, he wandered away from the room where he had been communicating with authorities before eventually returning and claiming that the instructions had been delivered. In reality, countless passengers remained exactly where they had been all along, unaware of how rapidly conditions aboard the Sewol were deteriorating. Meanwhile, the announcements telling people to stay put continued. Inside cabins throughout the ferry, students listened carefully to every word. Many of them had never faced an emergency situation before, and there was little reason for them to doubt the instructions they were hearing. Teachers reinforced those instructions because they too believed the crew knew best. Parents who would later speak to their children by phone often gave the same advice: stay calm, listen to the crew, follow instructions. The tragic irony was that everyone was acting in good faith. The students trusted the adults around them. The teachers trusted the crew. The parents trusted the authorities. and the passengers trusted the announcements being repeated over the public address system. While all of that trust was being placed in the people responsible for managing the crisis, the reality aboard the Sewol was becoming increasingly alarming. The ferry continued leaning further onto its side. Movement throughout the vessel was becoming more difficult, and precious minutes were passing without any meaningful evacuation taking place. Communications between the ship and authorities continued, but the information being shared was often incomplete, contradictory, or simply untrue. What should have been the beginning of an organized emergency response was instead becoming a maze of confusion, delays, and missed opportunities. While emergency calls were being made aboard the Sewol, and authorities were trying to piece together what was happening, another wave of communication was spreading across South Korea. This time it wasn't between the ferry and emergency services, it was between children and their parents. As the vessel continued listing further onto its side, many of the students reached for their phones. One of the unusual aspects of the Sewol's route was that much of the journey remained close enough to the coastline for passengers to maintain cellular service. At a time when communication would become the most valuable thing many of them possessed, their phones were still working. Across the ferry, text messages began appearing on screens. Calls were placed, voice messages were recorded. Parents who had expected to spend the morning going about their normal routines suddenly found themselves staring at messages that no parent ever wants to receive. Some were short and direct. Others sounded almost casual, as though the students themselves were still trying to convince themselves that everything would be okay. One student sent a message to their family, explaining that the ferry was tilting and that something strange was happening on board. Another texted simply to say they were scared. Some called home hoping to hear a familiar voice, while others sent messages that hinted at fears they couldn't quite bring themselves to say out loud. As those messages arrived, parents naturally became alarmed. Most of them knew very little about what was happening. They weren't watching events unfold in real time. They were receiving fragments of information from frightened teenagers hundreds of kilometers away, trying desperately to understand whether this was a temporary problem or a genuine emergency. Fortunately, many of the students had reassuring news to share. The crew had told them to stay where they were. They had been instructed to put on life jackets. Rescue efforts were reportedly underway. Help was coming. For worried parents, those details provided some comfort. The situation sounded frightening, but it also sounded organized. If trained professionals were handling the emergency and rescue teams were already responding, then surely everything would be all right. Many parents gave remarkably similar advice. Stay calm, listen to the crew, don't go off on your own, stay with your friends. Again and again, mothers and fathers reassured their children that rescue teams would arrive soon. They told them to stick together, to stay where they were told, and to trust the adults managing the situation. Looking back, those conversations would become some of the most painful memories many of the families carried with them. At the time, however, nobody had any reason to believe that following instructions would place the students in greater danger. One parent later recalled telling their child that everything would be fine because the Coast Guard was already on the way. Another encouraged their son to remain with his classmates and listen carefully to the announcements being made aboard the ferry. Across the country, hundreds of parents were offering the same comfort they had offered throughout their children's lives. They were trying to calm their fears, reassure them, and convince them that help was coming. The heartbreaking reality was that many of those parents believed every word they were saying. As the morning progressed, some of the messages became increasingly emotional. Students who had initially treated the situation as a temporary inconvenience began expressing deeper fears. Several sent messages telling their families they loved them. Others apologized for past arguments or misunderstandings. One student wrote that they hoped they would be able to meet again alive. Another asked for forgiveness if they had ever hurt anyone. Another told their parents to never let their little sister go on another school trip. Many parents desperately tried calling back. Some managed to reach their children, others couldn't. As conditions aboard the ferry worsened, phone batteries began draining, signals became unreliable, and communication became increasingly difficult. Yet even as contact grew more sporadic, most families still believed rescue efforts were progressing. Then the news reports began. Across South Korea, television stations started broadcasting updates about the sinking ferry. For a brief period, those reports brought enormous relief to the families watching at home. News outlets began announcing that all passengers aboard the Sewol had been rescued. The statement spread rapidly. Parents who had spent the morning terrified suddenly felt the weight lift from their shoulders. Some cried with relief, others immediately began trying to contact their children, expecting them to answer at any moment. The nightmare, it seemed, was over. Except it wasn't. Minutes later, confusion began replacing relief. Parents continued calling their children but received no answers. Text messages went unread. Phones rang endlessly without response. Families started contacting one another, wondering if anyone had successfully spoken to their children since hearing the news. Some assumed phones had been lost or batteries had died during the rescue. Others tried convincing themselves that their children were simply being processed by emergency responders. Then the numbers started changing. News reports that had confidently declared everyone rescued suddenly became less certain. Broadcasters began revising their figures. First, they reported that most passengers had been rescued. Then the number dropped again. Soon the totals being announced seemed completely inconsistent with what had been reported only moments earlier. For many parents, it felt like reality itself was shifting beneath their feet. How could someone be rescued one moment and missing the next? How could hundreds of people supposedly be safe if none of their families could reach them? The questions multiplied faster than anyone could answer them. What had begun as relief was quickly transforming into confusion, fear, and suspicion. Parents who had spent the morning trusting official information were beginning to realize that something wasn't adding up. The updates coming from television stations seemed to contradict each other. Communication with their children was becoming more difficult. Nobody appeared able to provide clear answers about who had actually been rescued and who was still aboard the ferry. As the hours passed, a growing number of families came to the same terrifying conclusion. Something was very wrong, and whatever was happening aboard the Sewol, they were no longer convinced that anyone was telling them the truth. As the Sewol continued to lean further onto its side, rescue resources slowly began arriving at the scene. From a distance, it looked like help had finally come. Helicopters appeared overhead, Coast Guard vessels moved toward the ferry. News broadcasts showed emergency responders gathering around the stricken ship, and for anyone watching from home, it may have appeared that a large-scale rescue operation was underway. The reality was far different. One of the first rescue assets to arrive was a Coast Guard helicopter. As it approached the ferry, the situation was already visibly serious. The Sewol was listing heavily and taking on water, but it had not yet disappeared beneath the surface. Large portions of the vessel remained above water, and perhaps most importantly, there were still passengers alive inside. The helicopter crew managed to rescue several people who were already visible on the exterior of the ferry. These individuals were brought aboard and flown to safety, demonstrating something that would become increasingly difficult to ignore as the disaster unfolded. Rescue was possible. People could be saved. The vessel had not yet vanished beneath the waves. There was still time. Yet despite that fact, the response seemed strangely passive. Additional helicopters arrived and began circling overhead, but many survivors and later investigators would question why so little was being done to reach the hundreds of passengers who remained trapped inside the ferry. The aircraft hovered above the scene, observing events as they unfolded, while the vast majority of those aboard the Sewol remained exactly where they had been instructed to stay. Inside the ferry, students and passengers were still listening to announcements telling them not to move. Outside the ferry, rescue teams were arriving, and somehow, Those two realities never seemed to connect. Around the same time, Coast Guard Vessel 123 reached the scene, and it would later become one of the most heavily scrutinized aspects of the disaster, because it was among the first rescue vessels to arrive within close proximity of the sinking ferry. Once again, the opportunity to save lives still existed. The vessel was not fully submerged. Passengers were still alive. Rescue teams were physically present. But what happened next would become one of the most controversial moments of the entire tragedy. Among the first people evacuated from the seawall were members of the crew, including the captain. Captain Lee Jun-suk had spent the previous critical minutes communicating with authorities while passengers remained trapped throughout the vessel. Yet when evacuation began, he was among those who left the ferry. According to later investigations, he boarded a rescue craft wearing ordinary clothing, rather than anything that would immediately identify him as the captain. At no point did he remain behind to coordinate a mass evacuation, and at no point did he make a meaningful effort to ensure that rescuers understood how many passengers remained aboard. Perhaps most astonishingly, after reaching safety, he still failed to clearly communicate that hundreds of people were trapped inside the ferry. The person who knew the vessel best, the person responsible for everyone aboard, the person who understood the layout of the ship, the number of passengers, and the severity of the situation, had left, and the passengers remained behind, and many other crew members followed. While students and teachers continued obeying announcements to stay where they were, crew members were escaping from the vessel that they had instructed everyone else to remain inside. The contrast is difficult to comprehend even years later. Passengers were trusting the crew with their lives. The crew, meanwhile, were saving themselves. What makes the situation even more painful is that rescue was still possible at this stage. The Sewol had not yet fully capsized. Large sections of the vessel remained accessible. Passengers could still have been directed toward exits and evacuation points. Additional rescue vessels could have been summoned. Large-scale efforts could have been organized. Instead, confusion continued to dominate the response. One of the most haunting images associated with the disaster involves a female student trapped inside the ferry. As the ship continued rolling onto its side, she found herself staring through a window toward the outside world. On the other side of that glass were rescuers. She could see them, and they could see her. Desperate to attract attention, she began throwing a chair against the window with all the strength she could muster. Again and again, she hurled it toward the glass, hoping to break through, hoping someone outside would understand that passengers were still trapped within the vessel. The effort appeared exhausting. The angle of the ferry was worsening. The situation was becoming increasingly desperate, and still she kept trying. Witnesses later described the look in her eyes not as anger, but as desperation. She knew people were outside. She knew rescuers had arrived. She could physically see them through the glass. Yet despite that, nobody came for her. For many people, that image came to symbolize the entire disaster. Passengers were not hidden. They were not impossible to find. They were there, waiting, watching, believing help had arrived, and yet somehow remaining trapped. Meanwhile, confusion continued spreading among responding agencies. Different organizations appeared to be operating independently, with little coordination between them. Information moved slowly. Responsibility shifted from one department to another. Decisions that should have been made immediately seemed to stall as officials attempted to determine who was ultimately in charge. At one point, even assistance from outside South Korea became a possibility. A nearby United States Navy vessel became aware of the unfolding disaster and reportedly offered support. The ship possessed substantial resources, including helicopters, rescue boats, and highly trained personnel capable of assisting with maritime emergencies. Given the scale of the crisis, such assistance might have provided valuable support during the critical early hours, yet the offer was not immediately embraced. As confusion continued to dominate the response, Opportunities that might have improved the rescue efforts slipped away. Hours earlier, the focus should have been on removing passengers from the ferry as quickly as possible. Instead, valuable time was disappearing while agencies struggled to coordinate their actions and understand the scope of the disaster. The tragedy of the seawall is often discussed as though the outcome became inevitable the moment the ferry began to sink. But that isn't entirely true. That morning, there were moments when the outcome could still have been different. There were moments when helicopters were overhead, moments when rescue vessels were alongside the ferry, moments when passengers were still alive inside, moments when large sections of the vessel remained above water, moments when people trapped within the ship could see rescuers looking back at them. And that is what makes this story so difficult to understand. The rescue teams arrived. The ferry had not yet disappeared. The passengers were still there. And somehow, the rescue that should have happened never truly came. One of the most difficult aspects of the Sewol tragedy is that it is often remembered through the failures. The failures of the ferry company, the failures of regulators, the failures of the crew, the failures of rescue agencies and government officials. Those failures deserve scrutiny because they contributed to the tragedy. Yet focusing only on those failures risks overlooking another side of the story. While some people abandoned their responsibilities, others embraced them. While some people thought first about saving themselves, others thought first about saving complete strangers. And while some ran from danger, others willingly moved toward it. Among those people was 22-year-old Park Ji-young. Park was one of the youngest crew members aboard the Sewol. In many ways, she was closer in age to the students than she was to many of her fellow crew members. Life had already been difficult for her. After the death of her father, financial pressures had forced her to leave school and begin working to help support her family. By April 2014, she was employed as a part-time crew member aboard the ferry. When the disaster began unfolding, Park had an opportunity that many passengers never received. She was near an area where escape was possible. She could have left the vessel. She could have climbed aboard one of the rescue boats and saved herself. Instead, she chose to go back. While confusion spread through the ship and passengers waited for instructions that would never come, Park moved through the ferry, telling students to evacuate. Witnesses later recalled seeing her distributing life jackets and directing frightened passengers toward safety. At one point, she reportedly gave her own life jacket to a student who didn't have one. Again and again, she returned deeper into the vessel, searching for more people who needed help. Survivors later described pleading with her to leave with them. One recalled grabbing her arm and telling her to come with them. She refused. According to the survivor, Park simply replied that she would leave after helping everyone else. Then she turned around and disappeared back into the ferry. It was the last time many people saw her alive. Her body was later recovered from the wreck. She still wasn't wearing a life jacket. Even in her final moments, she had chosen to give others a better chance of survival than herself. She would eventually be recognized as one of the heroes of the Sewol disaster. But for the students she helped that morning, she had already earned that title long before any official recognition arrived. Park wasn't alone. Elsewhere aboard the ferry, teachers found themselves facing impossible decisions. These were not rescue professionals. They were educators who had accompanied their students on what was supposed to be a routine school trip. Yet when the crisis unfolded, many instinctively did what they had always done throughout their careers. They put their students first. One of those teachers was Soo Young, a young teacher who was only in her second year of teaching. Like many aboard the ferry, she managed to contact family members as the situation deteriorated. When she informed her mother that the ship was sinking, her mother immediately urged her to put on a life jacket. Her response was heartbreaking in its simplicity. She explained that the students were already wearing the available life jackets. The implication was obvious. There weren't enough for everyone. Later, she spoke with her boyfriend and told him she loved him. When he attempted to continue the conversation, She reportedly explained that her phone battery was running low and that students still needed to use their phones to contact their families. Even during what would become her final hours, she was thinking about her students before herself. Then there was Ko Tan-suk, a physical education teacher whose actions during the disaster surprised absolutely nobody who knew him. Years earlier, while working at another school, Ko had been recognized for rushing into a burning building to save students during a fire. Courage wasn't something he suddenly discovered aboard the Sewol. It was simply part of who he was. When the ferry began sinking, he once again chose the safety of his students over his own. Survivors later recalled how teachers moved through the ferry, trying to care for frightened students and maintain some sense of order during an increasingly chaotic situation. Ko remained with the children he was responsible for, helping them until the very end. His body would not be recovered for several years. When students later gathered to remember him, many spoke not about his death, but about his character. To them, he had done exactly what they expected him to do. He had stayed. The same was true of two young crew members who had planned to spend the rest of their lives together. Jung Hyun-sun and Kim Ki-woong were both 28 years old and engaged to be married. Their wedding was scheduled for later that year. Like others aboard the ferry, they had opportunities to escape. Instead, witnesses described them helping students and passengers as conditions worsened throughout the vessel. Both ultimately lost their lives. The future they had planned together never arrived. Yet even in the face of overwhelming danger, they chose to spend their final hours helping others rather than saving themselves. Another crew member, Yong Dae-young, also remained aboard the ferry as the disaster unfolded. At one point, he managed to contact his wife. Knowing the situation was growing increasingly dire, he told her where she could find the family's savings for their son's future education. His wife begged him to save himself, but according to reports, Yang told her he couldn't stay on the phone because he needed to help the children. Those would be among his final words. His body was recovered months later. While these acts of courage were unfolding aboard the Sewol, similar acts of bravery were taking place on the water surrounding it. Long before official rescue operations became organized, local fishermen and civilian boat operators began moving toward the sinking ferry. Unlike many of the agencies that would later become the focus of public criticism, these men didn't wait for instructions. They saw people in danger and acted. One fisherman later recalled seeing the ferry listing heavily from a distance and immediately realizing something was terribly wrong. Without hesitation, he steered toward the vessel and began pulling passengers from the freezing water. Conditions were dangerous. The ferry itself posed a hazard, and every minute increased the risk to anyone operating nearby. Yet they continued, again and again, boat after boat, person after person. Many of the people rescued that day owed their lives not to official rescue agencies, but to ordinary citizens who refused to stand by and watch. Some of those fishermen would later struggle with guilt, despite saving numerous lives. One man was credited with rescuing around 25 people, yet he said he found little comfort in the number, because so many others had been lost. He couldn't stop thinking about those who remained trapped inside. That sense of responsibility seemed to unite many of the heroes of the Sewol tragedy. They weren't thinking about recognition, they weren't thinking about awards, they weren't thinking about how history would remember them. They simply saw people who needed help and acted. Perhaps no one embodies that better than Choi Duk-ha, the student whose emergency call helped alert authorities during the earliest moments of the disaster. While many students understandably focused on contacting family members, Choi spent precious time providing information to emergency services and helping responders understand what was happening aboard the ferry. His actions reflected a level of maturity and selflessness far beyond his years. After his death, his parents learned what he had done. Rather than feeling anger that he hadn't called them first, they expressed pride. They believed their son had tried to help others during a moment of crisis, and that his actions reflected the kind of person he had always been. In a tragedy defined by failure, confusion, and heartbreak. Stories like these serve as reminders that courage still existed aboard the Sewol. Not everyone ran. Not everyone abandoned their responsibilities. Not everyone chose themselves. Some people stayed, some people helped, and some people gave everything they had trying to save others. Their actions could not stop the disaster, but they ensured that even in one of South Korea's darkest moments, humanity was not entirely lost. As the hours passed, and communication with the students aboard the Sewol became increasingly difficult, families across South Korea found themselves desperately searching for answers. The text messages had stopped, calls were no longer being answered. News reports seemed to change by the minute. One moment everyone had supposedly been rescued, and the next those numbers were being revised downward without explanation. For many parents, sitting at home and watching the confusion unfold on television became unbearable. If nobody could tell them what was happening, they would go and find out for themselves. Their destination was Jeju Island, the closest major island to where the Sewol had gone down. Throughout the day, parents, siblings, grandparents, and relatives began making the journey south. Some drove for hours, others traveled by bus or train. Many barely remembered the journey itself. Their minds were consumed by a single thought: find my child. When the families arrived on Jeju Island, they expected to find some kind of organized emergency response center. After all, hundreds of people were missing at sea. Surely there would be a system in place to provide information, coordinate families, and answer questions. Instead, they found confusion. The Jeju Gymnasium quickly became the gathering point for families of passengers aboard the Sewol. Before long, the building was packed with anxious relatives desperately trying to learn who had survived and who was still missing. The atmosphere inside was unlike anything most of them had ever experienced. Hundreds of frightened people were gathered under one roof, all sharing the same terrifying uncertainty. What made the situation even more frustrating was the lack of organization. Many families later recalled that it felt as though nobody had prepared for this moment. Information was scattered, updates were inconsistent. There seemed to be no core system for tracking passengers or communicating with relatives. In many ways, it was the families themselves who began creating order from the chaos. Parents started organizing lists. They collected names. They identified which passengers were students, which were teachers, and which were other travelers aboard the ferry. Groups formed naturally as families tried to support one another and piece together whatever information they could find. It was ordinary people attempting to build a coordination center, while officials struggled to provide answers. Perhaps the most painful focal point inside the gymnasium was a series of large whiteboards that displayed the names of people reported to have survived. Families crowded around them constantly. Every time a name was added, dozens of people would rush forward. Some searched for sons, others searched for daughters, some searched for husbands, wives, brothers, or sisters. Every glance at those boards carried the possibility of relief or devastation. Parents would scan every line repeatedly, terrified they had somehow overlooked a name. Even after checking once, many found themselves returning moments later to check again. Hope has a way of making people look twice. For some families, there was a brief moment of joy. They found the name they had been searching for. Their child was listed among the survivors. Relief washed over them. Then the questions began. If their child had survived, where were they? Why couldn't anyone contact them? Why weren't they answering their phone? Why had nobody reunited them with their family? One relative stood in front of a survivor list and pointed to the name of a loved one that had supposedly been rescued. Yet despite being listed as safe, nobody could explain where that person actually was. The contradictions kept growing. Throughout the day, survivor numbers seemed to change constantly. Television stations announced one figure, government agencies announced another, rescue officials provided different totals altogether. Families who had already been told their loved ones were safe suddenly discovered that the information might have been wrong. The emotional whiplash was almost impossible to process. One moment they were celebrating. The next they were terrified all over again. Parents began describing the experience as feeling like their children were being rescued and then unrescued in real time. Every update seemed to contradict the one that came before it. Nobody knew which numbers were accurate anymore. As the confusion deepened, frustration started turning into anger. Families weren't demanding miracles. They weren't asking for guarantees. They simply wanted honest information. Instead, they felt as though they were being fed a constant stream of conflicting reports that nobody could explain. Questions began echoing throughout the gymnasium. Who was in charge? How many people had actually been rescued? How many were still missing? What exactly was happening at the scene? The more questions families asked, the more it seemed that nobody had answers. Some officials appeared hesitant to provide information because they weren't certain it was correct. Others gave updates that were later proven wrong. Rumors spread through the building faster than facts, creating an atmosphere where nobody knew what to believe anymore. The uncertainty was torture. For many parents, the worst part wasn't knowing their children were in danger. It was not knowing anything at all. A confirmed tragedy, horrible as it would have been, at least offered certainty. What they were experiencing instead was an endless cycle of hope and despair. Every new update carried the possibility that their child was safe, only for that hope to be ripped away minutes later. As evening approached, the mood inside the gymnasium grew noticeably darker. The optimism that had existed earlier in the day was beginning to fade. The rescue numbers weren't adding up. Children who had supposedly been saved were nowhere to be found. Phone calls remained unanswered. And despite all the television coverage, all the official statements, and all the promises that rescue operations were underway, very few people seemed capable of explaining what was actually happening out at sea. Many of the families had arrived on Jeju Island, believing they would soon be reunited with their loved ones. By the end of the day, a growing number feared that they had been brought there for an entirely different reason. They just didn't know it yet. But the trust they once had in the information being given to them was beginning to disappear, and in its place something far more powerful was taking hold: anger. As darkness began settling over Jeju Island, the atmosphere inside the gymnasium shifted yet again. Earlier in the day, many of the families had arrived believing they would soon be reunited with their loved ones. They had clung to the early reports claiming everyone had been rescued. Even when those reports began changing, many still held on to hope that there had simply been confusion during a large-scale rescue operation. Surely, they thought, once the chaos settled, the students and passengers would start arriving. But as the hours passed, that hope became harder and harder to hold on to. The phones remained silent, the answers never came, and outside, night was falling. It began spreading among the families that some parents were heading toward the harbor. The gymnasium had become a place filled with rumors and conflicting information, but the harbor offered something different. From there, they could at least look toward the water where the Sewol had gone down. It wasn't much, but it felt better than sitting beneath fluorescent lights, waiting for news that never seemed to arrive. Slowly, groups of parents began making their way there. Many of them carried blankets. At first glance, it may have seemed like a practical decision. The air was growing colder as evening approached, and the sea breeze coming off the water made it feel colder still. But those blankets weren't really for the parents. They were for their children. Some parents later explained that they couldn't stop thinking about the cold. The water in April was frigid, and even those who believed their children had survived couldn't bear the thought of them being cold and frightened. So they brought blankets, not because they knew their children would need them, but because they hoped they would. It was a parent's instinct refusing to let go. At the harbor, families gathered along the shoreline, staring out into the darkness. Somewhere beyond the horizon was the ferry. Somewhere beyond the horizon were their children. Yet, the sea revealed nothing. The water stretched endlessly into the distance, offering no answers and no comfort. What made the situation almost unbearable was the feeling of complete helplessness. Parents are wired to protect their children, It is perhaps the strongest instinct many people will ever experience. If a child falls, a parent rushes to help them up. If a child is scared, a parent comforts them. If a child is in danger, a parent does everything within their power to keep them safe. But what happens when your child is out there in the dark and there is absolutely nothing you can do? That question haunted every parent standing at that harbor. As frustration continued building, many began demanding boats. Some pleaded, others shouted. One father reportedly yelled that he didn't care how much it cost. He would pay for a boat himself if someone would simply take him to where the ferry was. Others echoed the same sentiment. They weren't asking for permission anymore. They were asking for a chance to see for themselves, a chance to help, a chance to do something, anything. The thought of remaining on shore while their children were trapped somewhere out at sea was becoming unbearable. Several parents openly discussed going into the water themselves. To outside observers, it may have sounded irrational, but grief and fear rarely follow logic. These were mothers and fathers who believed their children might still be alive. Every passing minute felt stolen. Every delay felt personal. At one point, a father reportedly attempted to throw himself into the water and had to be restrained by those around him. Others broke down completely. One parent cried that their child was somewhere beneath the water while they stood safely on shore. Another said they hated themselves because they could do nothing while their son or daughter remained out there. The emotions pouring out at the harbor were raw and impossible to contain. Fear had evolved into desperation, and desperation was beginning to resemble despair. One moment from that night stayed with many of the families for years afterward. As temperatures continued dropping, someone attempted to place a blanket around a grieving mother. The gesture was meant kindly, but it shattered whatever composure she had left. She burst into tears. What good was staying warm, she asked, when the children were freezing out there? The question hung in the air, and nobody had an answer. The blankets that had been brought with such hope suddenly felt meaningless. The harbor itself felt abandoned. Families looked around searching for someone in charge, someone who could explain what was happening, someone who could tell them what rescue efforts were underway. Instead, many later recalled being struck by who wasn't there. There were no senior government officials standing beside them. No one came to answer their questions. No one came to share their grief. No one came to explain why so little information seemed available. The people suffering the most were left largely alone with their fear. As the night grew darker, the sea seemed to swallow the horizon completely. The lights of the harbor reflected against the water, but beyond that was only blackness. Parents stood staring into it for hours. Some prayed, some cried, some sat silently wrapped in blankets they had originally intended for their children. Every passing minute felt like an eternity. Every phone vibration caused hearts to race. Every approaching vehicle sparked fresh hope that news had finally arrived. And every time that hope faded, the reality became a little harder to bear. What none of them knew was that this was only the beginning. The long night at Jeju Island would become one of the defining memories of the tragedy. Not because anything happened there, but because nothing happened there. Hundreds of families stood together at the edge of the sea, waiting for answers, waiting for rescue, waiting for someone to tell them that their children were safe. Instead, they watched darkness settle over the water, and they waited, and waited, and waited, while somewhere beyond the horizon the fate of their loved ones remained unknown. As families spent the night staring out across the dark waters surrounding Jeju Island, many clung to a fragile hope that rescue operations were continuing beyond the horizon. They had to believe that. The alternative was unbearable. Television broadcasts, official statements, and press conferences continued painting a picture of an enormous rescue effort. Ships had supposedly been mobilized. Divers were reportedly working tirelessly. Helicopters had been dispatched. Government agencies repeatedly assured the public that every available resource was being thrown at the disaster. From a distance, it sounded as though hundreds of rescuers were engaged in a desperate race against time. The reality offshore looked very different. Even as the first night unfolded, the Sewol had not completely disappeared from sight. Portions of the vessel remained visible above the waterline for hours, serving as a constant reminder that the tragedy was still unfolding. This was not a wreck hidden deep beneath the ocean. It was a disaster occurring in plain view. And yet many observers struggled to identify what meaningful rescue efforts were actually taking place. Throughout the evening, Coast Guard vessels remained in the area surrounding the ferry. Helicopters occasionally passed overhead. From television cameras and official photographs, the scene appeared active. There were boats, there were aircraft, there were personnel, there was activity. What many witnesses later questioned was whether there was action. To grieving families gathered on Jeju Island, those two things were not the same. As hours passed, parents became increasingly desperate for information about what was happening at the scene. Some managed to speak with individuals who had traveled closer to the wreck site. Others relied on journalists and reporters who were attempting to gather information independently. What they began hearing was deeply troubling. The image being presented to the public did not seem to match what people were seeing with their own eyes. Reporters who traveled toward the area described long stretches of inactivity. Rather than witnessing a coordinated rescue operation illuminated by floodlights and packed with divers entering and exiting the water, many described an eerily quiet scene. The ferry remained there. Rescue vessels remained there. Yet the frantic search that families imagined was taking place often appeared absent. For parents already struggling to trust the information they were receiving, these accounts were devastating. The discrepancy became impossible to ignore. Official statements spoke of intensive rescue efforts. Witnesses described watching vessels circle the area. Officials talked about personnel being deployed. Families wanted to know exactly what those personnel were doing. The deeper they looked, the more confusing the situation became. Some parents eventually made arrangements to get closer to the area themselves. Others received updates from relatives, reporters, and volunteers who had traveled offshore. Again and again, similar stories emerged. People expected to witness a massive emergency operation. Instead, they saw ships maintaining positions around the wreck, while little seemed to be changing. To the families, every minute mattered. They were still holding on to the possibility that survivors could be trapped somewhere inside the ferry. They knew the vessel had not instantly filled with water. They knew there was a chance that air pockets could exist within parts of the ship. They knew their children had been alive only hours earlier. So every report of inactivity felt impossible to understand. The parents were not maritime experts. They were not rescue specialists. But they knew one thing with absolute certainty. If there was even the slightest chance that people were still alive inside the ferry, then every second counted. As the night wore on, frustration slowly transformed into suspicion. Many families began feeling as though they were watching two separate realities unfold at the same time. In one reality, the one presented through official briefings and media statements, a massive rescue effort was underway. Resources were being deployed. Authorities were working around the clock. Everything possible was being done. In the other reality, the one described by witnesses and increasingly observed by families themselves, there seemed to be an alarming lack of urgency. The gap between those two realities grew wider with every passing hour. Parents found themselves asking increasingly direct questions. If rescue operations were happening, where were they? If divers were entering the water, why weren't people seeing them? If hundreds of personnel had been mobilized, what exactly were they doing? Nobody seemed capable of providing clear answers. What made the situation even more painful was the simple fact that hope still existed. Had the ferry vanished instantly beneath the ocean, many of these questions might never have arisen. But that wasn't what happened. The Sewol remained partially visible for a significant period of time. Families knew this. Reporters knew this. Witnesses knew this. That visibility became a symbol of everything that haunted the tragedy. The ferry was there, the passengers had been there, the rescue assets were there, yet somehow those pieces never seemed to come together. By the early hours of the morning, many parents no longer felt that they were merely waiting for news. They felt they were being kept in the dark. The trust that had already begun eroding inside the Jindo Gymnasium continued crumbling as more information emerged. Every contradiction, every inaccurate report, and every unanswered question deepened the growing sense that something was fundamentally wrong. For the families gathered on Jindo Island, the issue was no longer simply the sinking of the Sewol. It was the growing belief that what they were being told and what was actually happening were two entirely different things. And as dawn approached, that belief was becoming impossible to ignore. The rescue effort that existed on paper seemed enormous. The rescue effort witnessed by many parents and observers seemed far smaller. Between those two versions of events lay a question that would haunt South Korea for years to come. What was really happening out there? As the first day of the Sewol disaster unfolded, news of the sinking spread rapidly across South Korea. For most people watching from home, the reports were confusing. Information changed by the hour. Survivor numbers rose and fell. Official statements often contradicted one another. Yet among the millions following the story were people who viewed the disaster through a very different lens: professional divers. Many of them had spent years working in dangerous conditions. They understood the challenges of underwater rescue operations. They knew how precious the first hours could be following a maritime disaster. Most importantly, they knew that if passengers were trapped inside the ferry, time was running out. When they first heard reports that every passenger aboard the Sewol had been rescued, many of them breathed a sigh of relief. There was no reason to rush to the scene if everyone was already safe. The problem, of course, was that the reports were wrong. As the hours passed and contradictions began emerging, experienced divers started becoming suspicious. The information coming from television broadcasts simply didn't make sense. Survivor numbers were changing too dramatically. Details about rescue efforts seemed vague. Some divers later explained that even from a professional standpoint, the reports sounded off. The story being presented to the public didn't align with how a successful rescue operation would normally unfold. Slowly, many of them came to the same conclusion: something wasn't right. Even if everyone had been rescued, they reasoned, there was no harm in traveling to Jindo Island to see whether additional help was needed. If the rescue operation was truly over, they could always turn around and go home. But if it wasn't, then every hour mattered. Many volunteer divers immediately began preparing their equipment and making the journey south. Some traveled from Seoul, others came from different parts of the country. They left jobs, businesses, and families behind because they believed there might still be people alive inside the ferry. The tragedy is that precious time had already been lost. Had the true situation been communicated from the beginning, many of these volunteers would have mobilized much sooner. Instead, false reports claiming that everyone had been rescued delayed the arrival of people who genuinely wanted to help. By the time many of the divers finally reached Jindo Island, the atmosphere surrounding the rescue operation was unlike anything they had expected. They arrived prepared to work. Instead, many felt as though they had stepped into a maze of bureaucracy. Volunteer divers reported being directed to a Coast Guard command vessel operating near the disaster site. They expected briefings, assignments, and immediate deployment into the water. What they encountered instead left many of them stunned. Several divers later described being led around the vessel and introduced to various officials and personnel, while urgent rescue opportunities continued slipping away. Conversations focused on backgrounds, credentials, and formalities rather than getting people into the water. The divers found themselves answering questions about their experience, their equipment, and where they had traveled from, all while believing there were still passengers trapped inside the ferry. One diver later recalled feeling completely bewildered by the experience. He had arrived expecting urgency. What he found instead was delay. The frustration only grew as time passed. Many volunteers began questioning why they were being prevented from doing the very thing they had traveled there to do. They were trained, they were willing, they understood the risks. Yet rather than being deployed, they often found themselves waiting, and waiting, and waiting. Then came an incident that would become symbolic of everything many volunteers felt was wrong with the response. One diver later described how, while rescue opportunities were slipping away, officials aboard the command vessel appeared far more focused on meetings and routine activities than on getting divers into the water. At one point, ramen noodles were brought in for senior personnel. What should have been a command center coordinating a desperate rescue operation instead struck some volunteers as detached from the reality unfolding just outside. For many divers, the image became impossible to forget. Children were trapped inside a ferry. Families were waiting for answers, and yet some of the people overseeing the operation appeared oddly disconnected from the urgency of the moment. The so-called ramen incident became one of the stories that divers would later recount when describing their experiences. It wasn't really about the food itself, it was about what the moment represented. To the volunteers, it symbolized a system that seemed more comfortable discussing rescue efforts than actually carrying them out. Meanwhile, official statements continued painting a very different picture. Press conferences spoke of resources being mobilized and personnel being deployed. Numbers were cited. Operations were described. The public was assured that everything possible was being done. Many of the volunteers listening to those statements were left speechless. They knew what they had seen. They knew how much time had been spent waiting. They knew how many obstacles had been placed in front of people who simply wanted to help. Several divers later came forward describing their experiences anonymously. The stories often share the same themes: delays, confusion, endless procedures, a sense that those making decisions were more concerned with appearances than results. What frustrated them most was that nobody was asking them to perform miracles. They understood that diving into a sinking ferry was dangerous. They understood that conditions could be difficult. They understood that lives were at risk, including their own. What they couldn't understand was why so many people seemed determined to slow down those who were actually willing to try. To the volunteers, the situation felt painfully simple. There were potentially hundreds of people trapped inside a ferry. There were trained divers standing ready to enter the water. The only question should have been how quickly they could begin. Instead, many felt they were being treated as an inconvenience. Looking back, numerous volunteer divers expressed the same lingering frustration. They had not traveled to Jeju Island for recognition. They had not traveled there for money. Most were risking their own safety without any guarantee of compensation or support. They came because they believed human lives were worth saving. And while official agencies struggled with coordination, bureaucracy, and public messaging, the volunteers never lost sight of that goal. The volunteers were not perfect. They did not possess unlimited resources. They could not change what had already happened aboard the Sewol. But unlike so many others involved in the disaster, their priority remained remarkably clear. They weren't worried about careers. They weren't worried about politics. They weren't worried about public image. They were worried about the people still trapped inside the ferry. And more than anything, they wanted the chance to help them. As the days passed following the sinking of the Sewol, hope slowly began changing shape. In the beginning, families had hoped for rescue. Then they hoped for survivors. Now many were simply hoping for answers. One of the reasons that hope lingered for so long was because of a phenomenon well known to maritime rescuers. When large vessels sink, sections of the ship can sometimes trap pockets of air. These spaces can remain habitable for a period of time, allowing survivors to cling to life long after a vessel disappears beneath the surface. It wasn't common, and it wasn't guaranteed, but it was possible. For the families gathered at Jeju Island, possible was enough. As long as there was even the slightest chance that someone might still be alive inside the ferry, They refused to give up. The divers felt the same way. Every time they entered the water, they carried that possibility with them. The Sewol now rested beneath the surface, transformed from a passenger ferry into a maze of darkness, twisted hallways, and submerged rooms. What had once been a place filled with excited students preparing for a holiday had become something almost unrecognizable. The vessel lay on its side, beneath the cold waters of the mangled channel, its interior completely altered by the force of the sinking. Floors had become walls, walls had become ceilings. Rooms that passengers had once walked through normally were now tilted at impossible angles. For the divers entering the wreck, simply finding their way around was a challenge. Visibility was often almost non-existent. The water inside the ferry was thick with debris, mud, and floating objects that had been ripped loose during the sinking. A diver could shine a light directly in front of their face and still struggle to see more than a short distance ahead. Every movement stirred up more sediment, reducing visibility even further. Many described the experience as moving through complete darkness. The ferry's hallways presented another danger. When the ship rolled onto its side, furniture, luggage, fixtures, and debris shifted with it. Corridors became clogged with obstacles. Some passageways were so narrow that divers had to squeeze through spaces barely wider than their shoulders. In some places, collapsed walls and twisted metal created bottlenecks that had to be navigated with extreme caution. One wrong movement could snag an air hose. One wrong turn could leave a diver trapped. One moment of panic could prove fatal. Yet they continued going back, again and again, because inside those dark corridors were the people they had come to find. The first recoveries were heartbreaking. Divers searching the interior of the Sewol soon discovered what many had feared. The vast majority of those still inside had never escaped the vessel. They had remained where they were told to stay. In classrooms, cabins, and common areas, rescuers began finding victims who had spent their final moments waiting for help that never arrived. Many of the divers would later say there are certain things they can never forget. Not the cold, not the danger, not even the exhaustion. What stayed with them most were the children. Again and again, divers encountered groups of students who had remained together until the very end. Some were found side by side. Others were discovered holding on to one another. In several cases, victims were found embracing friends, classmates, or people they had sought comfort from during their final moments. The divers spoke often about the loneliness those children must have felt as the water rose around them. But they also spoke about something else. How many of them had refused to face that fear alone? One of the most haunting discoveries involved students who had tied themselves together using the cords attached to their life jackets. The image became one of the defining stories of the Sewol tragedy. Among them were two 16-year-old students whose story would later touch people across South Korea. Nobody knows exactly what happened during their final moments. There were conflicting reports about how well they knew one another before the disaster. Some believed they were close friends, others said they barely interacted at school. Classmates later suggested they may not have known each other particularly well at all. Yet when a civilian diver eventually found them, they were together. The cords from their life jackets had been tied to one another. In the darkness and fear of the sinking ferry, they had made a simple decision. They would not face it alone. The diver later described how he had to separate them in order to recover their bodies. The task haunted him. He remembered crying as he worked because he understood what those tied cords represented. Whether they had been friends, acquaintances, or complete strangers before that day no longer mattered. In their final moments, they had become each other's comfort. The diver said he didn't want to separate them, but he had no choice. It remained one of the hardest recoveries of his life. Stories like that were not isolated. Many divers reported finding students clustered together throughout the wreck. Some had clearly tried to help one another. Others appeared to have gathered in groups as they waited for rescue. The details varied, but the pattern remained the same. The children had trusted the instructions they were given. They had trusted that someone would come for them. And they had waited. For the divers, these discoveries carried an emotional weight that was difficult to describe. Every recovery represented someone's son, daughter, friend, or classmate. Every body brought to the surface meant another family would finally receive an answer, but it also meant another hope had come to an end. Many divers later admitted that they struggled to sleep. Some couldn't stop replaying the images in their minds. Others found themselves imagining the final conversations that might have taken place inside those cabins. The water, the darkness, the waiting, the fear. Yet despite the emotional toll, they continued returning to the wreck. Each descent into the seawall carried the possibility of finding someone who had not yet been recovered. Each recovery brought a family one step closer to being able to lay their loved one to rest. It was exhausting work, dangerous work, heartbreaking work, but it was necessary, because beneath the surface of the Bengal Channel lay the truth of what had happened aboard the Sewol. Not the press conferences, not the official statements, not the conflicting reports, the truth. And with every dive, that truth became a little harder for the world to ignore. When most people think about the Sewol Ferry disaster, they think about the passengers who never came home, the families left behind, and the failures that allowed the tragedy to unfold. Far fewer people think about the men and women who entered the wreck long after the cameras had moved on. Yet for many of those volunteer divers, the Sewol would continue following them for years after the ferry disappeared beneath the water. For the public, the recovery effort was something viewed through news reports and photographs. For the divers, it was something they lived. Day after day, they descended into the darkness of the wreck, navigating collapsed corridors, twisted metal, and rooms filled with debris. They entered spaces that many trained rescue professionals refused to enter. They squeezed through openings barely wide enough for a human body, and worked in conditions where a single mistake could cost them their lives. The physical dangers were immense, but it was the emotional burden that proved impossible for many of them to escape. Some divers later spoke about the pact they made with one another before entering the ferry. They told themselves not to look too closely at the faces of the victims. They believed that if they allowed themselves to truly see the children they were recovering, it would become impossible to continue. They had a job to do. Families were waiting for answers. The victims deserved to come home. The divers knew they couldn't allow themselves to break down in the middle of that mission. But no matter how hard they tried, some images could never be forgotten. They recovered students who had spent their final moments holding one another. They found classmates gathered together in cabins. They discovered victims whose fingers had been broken from desperately trying to force open doors and windows. Again and again they encountered evidence of the children's final attempts to survive, and every discovery carried a weight that stayed with them long after they surfaced. Many divers later admitted that sleep became almost impossible. Every time they closed their eyes, they found themselves back inside the wreck. The darkness, the silence, the floating debris, the faces. Some woke from nightmares drenched in sweat. Others found themselves unable to be near water. Many struggled to explain their experiences to family members who had never seen what they had seen. One of those divers was Kim Zhang. Like many volunteers, he had watched the disaster unfold on television before rushing to Jeju Island to help. He spent months participating in recovery operations, repeatedly entering one of the most dangerous environments imaginable. He later described how the experience changed him permanently. The memories followed him everywhere. The images never left. He spoke openly about the nightmares, the anxiety, and the emotional exhaustion that consumed his life after the recovery effort ended. The psychological wounds were often accompanied by physical injuries. Inside the wreck, conditions were constantly changing. Debris shifted without warning. Metal structures collapsed. Air hoses became tangled. Sharp edges lurked in the darkness. During one dive, Kim suffered a serious shoulder injury when heavy luggage came crashing down onto him from a compartment that suddenly gave way. The injury eventually required surgery, but it was only one of countless injuries suffered by volunteer divers during the operation. Many returned home with damaged joints, chronic pain, and long-term health problems. Some experienced paralysis. Others suffered injuries that prevented them from ever diving again. Yet despite the sacrifices they made, many felt forgotten once the public attention faded. Kim Guan-hong was another volunteer diver whose story came to symbolize the cost of the recovery effort. He participated in numerous dives and helped recover many of the victims trapped inside the Sewol. At one point, he lost consciousness underwater and was swept away by currents before being rescued himself. After receiving medical treatment, he returned to the recovery effort. Like many others, he refused to walk away while there were still families waiting for their loved ones to be found. The physical injuries eventually healed as much as they could. Years later, Kim testified about the trauma he continued carrying from the recovery operation. He described how impossible it was to forget the things he had seen. He spoke about the emotional toll of handling the bodies of children and the lasting psychological scars left behind by those months inside the wreck. In 2017, Kim took his own life. His final message to his loved ones read, "I'll see you in a better place in the next life. I'm sorry." For many people following the Sewol tragedy, his death felt like another casualty of the disaster. He had survived the wreck, but he never escaped it. The dangers faced by the divers extended beyond trauma and injury. Several people involved in the recovery operation lost their lives. One diver died during recovery efforts after becoming entangled underwater. Others suffered medical emergencies linked to the demanding and hazardous conditions. Rescue personnel, civilian volunteers, and recovery teams all faced risks that were often invisible to the public watching from home. Yet despite everything they endured, many volunteers felt abandoned once their work was finished. Numerous divers found themselves burdened with medical bills for injuries sustained during recovery operations. Some struggled to receive recognition for conditions directly connected to their work at the Sewol site. Others became involved in lengthy legal battles and bureaucratic disputes while trying to secure assistance. Instead of being treated as people who had risked their lives for the victims, many felt as though they had become inconvenient reminders of a tragedy that authorities wanted to move beyond. The contrast was difficult to ignore. While officials held press conferences and defended their actions, the people who had physically entered the wreck were often left dealing with the consequences alone. Many suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. Others developed depression, anxiety disorders, and substance abuse problems. Families watched loved ones change before their eyes, struggling to recognize the person who had returned home from Jeju Island. One diver later explained that he could no longer comfortably hold his wife or children. The memories associated with touching the bodies he had recovered had become so deeply ingrained that even simple physical contact triggered emotional distress. Another described turning to alcohol simply to quiet the images that replayed in his mind every night. Perhaps the cruelest part was that many of these divers shared the same regret. Not that they volunteered, not that they entered the wreck, not that they risked their lives. Their greatest regret was arriving too late. Again and again, they expressed the belief that if rescue efforts had begun sooner, if they had been allowed to help earlier, perhaps someone could have been saved. Whether that belief was true or not hardly mattered. It became a burden many carried for years. The Sewol Ferry disaster left scars across an entire nation, but some of those scars remained hidden beneath the surface. Long after the ferry was gone, long after the headlines faded and the public moved on, many of the volunteer divers continued fighting battles that nobody else could see. They had entered the darkness to bring strangers home. In return, many carried a piece of that darkness back with them, and for some, it never left. By the second day of the Sewol disaster, many of the families gathered on Jeju Island had reached a painful realization. They could no longer rely on official information. The confusion that had surrounded the sinking from the very beginning was not improving. If anything, it was getting worse. Survivor numbers continued changing. Government agencies appeared to contradict one another. Rescue efforts remained unclear. Every update seemed to raise more questions than it answered. for parents desperately trying to understand what had happened to their children. The uncertainty became almost unbearable. At first, many had assumed that the chaos was simply the result of a large-scale emergency. Disasters were complicated. Mistakes happened. Information took time to verify. Most families wanted to believe that authorities were doing their best under impossible circumstances. But as the hours turned into days, that explanation became harder to accept. Too many statements were proving inaccurate. Too many promises were going unfulfilled. Too many questions remained unanswered. Instead of receiving clarity from officials, the families increasingly found themselves learning information from one another. Parents shared phone calls, text messages, and updates they had received from relatives, witnesses, and journalists. Information that should have been coming from authorities was being gathered and verified by the families themselves. Without formally planning it, the parents began building their own investigation. Inside the gymnasium at Jeju Island, they organized themselves into groups. Some tracked survivor lists. Others monitored media reports. Parents exchanged contact information and created communication networks so that information could be shared quickly and efficiently. Every new detail was compared against everything else they had already learned. The result was something government officials had not expected. The families became remarkably informed. In many cases, they knew more about what was happening than the people standing behind the podiums. As reports continued filtering back from the wreck site, parents began noticing glaring discrepancies between what they were being told and what witnesses were actually seeing. Officials claimed rescue operations were underway. Parents spoke with people who had been near the scene and heard very different accounts. Government representatives described intensive efforts taking place around the clock, yet families kept encountering evidence that suggested otherwise. The more information they gathered, the angrier they became. That anger eventually began spilling into public confrontations. One particularly revealing moment occurred when a parent challenged a government official who claimed that extensive rescue operations had continued throughout the night. The father had already spoken with people who had been at the scene and knew what he was being told didn't match reality. Rather than accepting the statement, he confronted the official directly and demanded that he repeat the claim while looking him in the eye. The official appeared caught off guard. Instead of answering confidently, he reportedly reached for his phone and began calling others, seemingly searching for explanations. It was a reaction that many families would witness repeatedly. Officials often spoke with certainty when addressing the public, but when confronted with contradictory evidence, that confidence seemed to disappear. Parents began noticing the pattern. The moment hard questions were asked, the answers became far less certain. Every contradiction further eroded what little trust remained. The families were no longer willing to simply sit quietly and accept official statements at face value. They wanted proof. They wanted accountability. Most of all, they wanted the truth. The tension reached a boiling point when senior government figures began visiting Jeju Island. The arrival of the Prime Minister was supposed to reassure families that the highest levels of government were engaged with the crisis. Instead, many parents viewed the visit as another example of officials appearing for cameras while providing few meaningful answers. By this stage, emotions were running dangerously high. Parents had spent days trapped between hope and terror. Many still had no idea whether their children were alive or dead. They had watched information change repeatedly. They had listened to promises that seemed disconnected from reality. Now, standing in front of them was one of the most powerful men in the country. The reaction was explosive. As the Prime Minister moved through the crowd, angry parents confronted him directly. Voices rose. Accusations were shouted. Some demanded answers, while others demanded action. The atmosphere quickly became chaotic. Then came the moment that would make headlines. Water bottles were thrown. For some observers, the incident appeared shocking. For many parents, however, it reflected the depth of their desperation. These were not people protesting taxes or politics. These were mothers and fathers who believed their children were trapped beneath the sea, while officials continued making promises they no longer trusted. Security personnel quickly moved to protect the prime minister and escort him away from the crowd. But the confrontation revealed something important. The families were no longer afraid to challenge authority. That same determination followed them into every interaction that came afterward. When officials gave numbers, parents questioned them. When agencies made claims, families demanded evidence. When promises were made, they wanted proof that those promises were being fulfilled. In many ways, the parents became investigators out of necessity. Nobody wanted that role. Nobody had traveled to Jeju Island expecting to spend their days fact-checking governance statements. They wanted to be parents waiting for their children to come home. Instead, they found themselves documenting contradictions, collecting information, and exposing inaccuracies because nobody else seemed willing to do it. What united the families was not politics, ideology, or even personal background. It was the belief that their loved ones deserved answers. That belief pushed them forward even when they were exhausted. It kept them organized when everything around them seemed chaotic. It gave them the strength to challenge officials who expected obedience and patience. The tragedy had already taken so much from them. They refused to let it take the truth as well. As the days passed, the family's determination only grew stronger. They would continue demanding answers. They would continue challenging inconsistencies. They would continue fighting for accountability long after the television cameras moved on, because by then they understood something that many officials had not yet realized. No one was going to fight harder for the truth than the people who had lost the most, and those families were only getting started. As the tragedy unfolded on the morning of April 16, 2014, South Korea found itself facing a disaster that demanded immediate leadership. Hundreds of passengers were aboard a ferry that was rapidly capsizing. Rescue agencies were struggling to coordinate their response. Information was conflicting and often inaccurate. Families were flooding phone lines searching for answers. Every minute mattered. In situations like these, nations often look to their leaders for reassurance and direction. People want to know that someone is in charge. They want to believe that somewhere decisions are being made and resources are being deployed. Whether those decisions ultimately succeed or fail, there is comfort in knowing leadership exists. During the Sewol disaster, many South Koreans would come to believe that leadership was absent. As reports of the sinking spread throughout the country, communication began flowing toward the Blue House, the South Korean equivalent of the White House. Information was arriving from the Coast Guard, rescue agencies, and government officials. Helicopter crews were reporting conditions at the scene. Updates were reaching senior levels of government. Yet instead of clarity, confusion seemed to spread. One of the most controversial aspects of the disaster involved communications between rescue personnel and the Blue House during the earliest stages of the emergency. Accounts from those involved suggested that while the situation at sea was becoming increasingly dire, officials at the highest levels of government appeared focused on gathering information rather than directing action. Particularly controversial were reports that helicopter crews and rescue officials were repeatedly asked to provide video footage of the disaster. The requests baffled many observers. At the scene, rescuers were describing a ferry that was visibly listing, taking on water, and rapidly approaching catastrophe. The situation itself appeared obvious, yet communications reportedly continued focusing on obtaining visual confirmation of what was already being described by personnel on the ground and in the air. Critics later argued that precious time was being spent documenting the disaster rather than responding to it. Supporters of the administration would counter that decision-makers needed accurate information before making critical choices. The debate continues to this day. What is not disputed is that many people watching events unfold felt as though nobody was truly taking command. As the hours passed, another controversy began taking shape. Questions emerged about President Park Geun-hye's whereabouts during the crucial early stages of the disaster. In the days that followed, government officials struggled to provide clear explanations regarding exactly what the president had been doing during the first several hours after the sinking began. Eventually, the phrase, "the missing 7 hours," entered South Korean public discourse. The words became shorthand for one of the most enduring controversies surrounding the Sewol tragedy. Where had the president been? What information had she received? What decisions had she made? And why did nobody seem capable of providing clear answers? The uncertainty fueled public anger. For grieving families, the issue was not simply where the president physically was, it was what her absence appeared to represent. While parents were gathering at Jeju Island, while rescue efforts were being questioned, and while students remained trapped aboard the ferry, many people felt there was no visible leadership coming from the nation's highest office. As pressure mounted, government records and schedules came under increasing scrutiny. Investigations and media reports would later raise questions about the accuracy of official timelines. Allegations emerged that records had been altered or reconstructed after the fact in an attempt to create a clearer picture of presidential activity during those critical hours. Whether those efforts were intended to clarify events or protect reputations became a matter of intense political debate. For many members of the public, however, the damage had already been done. The perception of a leadership vacuum had taken hold. Compounding the controversy were growing concerns about how information surrounding the disaster was being managed. As journalists began investigating inconsistencies in official accounts, some members of the media claimed they faced pressure for reporting stories that reflected poorly on the administration. Critics accused the government of being overly concerned with image management at a time when transparency was desperately needed. Journalists who questioned official narratives often found themselves facing intense scrutiny. Some reporters claimed they were pressured to soften criticism or avoid certain lines of inquiry altogether. The administration denied many of these accusations, yet the perception that uncomfortable questions were being discouraged only deepened public distrust. For families of the victims, every new revelation felt like another betrayal. They had already lost faith in many of the rescue agencies responsible for saving their children. Now they found themselves questioning whether the government was being honest about its own actions during the crisis. As investigations continued in the years that followed, the Sewol disaster became more than a maritime tragedy. It became a political reckoning. Questions about leadership, accountability, and transparency increasingly dominated public discussion. The image of a government unable to explain its own actions during one of the nation's darkest moments proved difficult to overcome. President Park's approval ratings suffered dramatically. Public confidence eroded. And for many South Koreans, the Sewol disaster became inseparable from broader concerns about governmental competence and responsibility. Years later, debates about the missing 7 hours would continue. Investigations would be launched. Documents would be reviewed. Testimony would be examined. Yet despite countless reports and analyses, many families felt that the central question remained unanswered. Not where the president was, but why nobody seemed to be leading, while students waited for rescue, while parents waited for answers, while a nation watched in horror. South Korea was facing a crisis that demanded decisive leadership. What many people remember instead is the silence. And in that silence, trust began to disappear. In the months following the Sewol disaster, South Korea searched desperately for answers. The nation had witnessed a ferry capsize in relatively calm waters. Hundreds of people had died. Rescue efforts had descended into confusion and controversy. Families were demanding accountability. Investigators were combing through records, interviewing employees and examining every decision that had led to April 16, 2014. What they discovered was deeply troubling. The Sewol had not sunk because of one mistake. It had sunk because of years of negligence. At the center of that negligence was Chonghaejin Marine, the company that owned and operated the ferry. As investigators began examining the company's finances and practices, a pattern quickly emerged. Again and again, decisions appeared to favor profit over safety. Corners were cut, regulations were ignored, risks were accepted. The safety of passengers seemed secondary to keeping money flowing. The Sewol itself was a perfect example. Originally built in Japan, the vessel had been purchased second-hand by Chonghaejin Marine. Rather than simply operating the ferry as designed, the company undertook major modifications after acquiring it. Additional passenger cabins were added to increase capacity and generate more revenue. Extra decks were built on top of the vessel, allowing more paying passengers to be carried on each trip. The problem was that every modification altered the ship's balance. Each addition pushed more weight upward, gradually raising the ferry's center of gravity. Maritime experts later warned that these changes made the vessel significantly less stable than it had originally been. A ship is carefully designed to maintain balance in rough conditions. When that balance is altered without sufficient safeguards, dangerous consequences can follow. Yet the modifications continued. One of the strangest additions was an art gallery. While the country would later mourn hundreds of lives lost aboard the Sewol, investigators discovered that space aboard the ferry had been devoted to displaying artwork connected to the family that ultimately controlled the company. Decorative installations, heavy materials, and gallery spaces had all been incorporated into the vessel. Not only did they generate additional revenue, but they added even more weight to a ship that was already becoming increasingly top-heavy. The further investigators looked, the worse the situation appeared. Attention soon turned to the people behind Chonghaejin Marine itself. The company was closely linked to the family of Yu Byung-un, a wealthy businessman and religious leader whose influence stretched across multiple corporate entities. Through a complex network of ownership structures, companies connected to Yu and his family benefited financially from Chonghaejin Marine, even as the ferry operator itself struggled financially. What shocked many people was that despite reporting financial difficulties, money continued flowing toward those connected to the ownership structure. While critical areas of safety received minimal investment, the company was making choices, and safety was not the priority. Perhaps nowhere was that more obvious than in employee training. When investigators reviewed company records, they discovered that safety training aboard the Sewol was astonishingly inadequate. Employees who should have been thoroughly prepared for emergencies often received little meaningful instruction at all. Some records suggested that training certificates were little more than paperwork exercises, providing the appearance of compliance without delivering actual preparation. The result was predictable. When disaster struck, many crew members had little understanding of how to respond. Some had never participated in realistic emergency drills. Others had no meaningful evacuation experience. The company had created the illusion of safety while neglecting the substance of it. Life-saving equipment also came under scrutiny. Investigators discovered that some safety equipment had not been properly inspected for years. Life jackets and emergency gear that should have been routinely maintained were often neglected. Equipment that passengers might depend upon in an emergency was not receiving the attention it deserved. Yet perhaps the most dangerous practice involved cargo. The Sewol generated most of its revenue through freight transportation. Every truck, shipping container, and vehicle loaded onto the ferry represented income. The more cargo carried, the greater the profit. There was just one problem. The company repeatedly loaded more cargo than the vessel was designed to safely carry. Investigators found evidence that overloading had become routine. On the day of the disaster, the Sewol was carrying significantly more cargo than regulations permitted. Worse still, much of that cargo was not properly secured. Vehicles and freight that should have been chained down and stabilized were instead left vulnerable to shifting during sharp maneuvers. When the ferry made its fatal turn, that cargo became a weapon. Hundreds of tons of weight slammed toward one side of the vessel, contributing directly to the chain of events that followed. What made the revelations even more disturbing was that these issues were not new. Long before the Sewol sank, warning signs had existed. Investigators uncovered records showing previous incidents involving the company. There had been accidents, complaints, and safety concerns stretching back years. Maritime officials had raised questions. Employees had voiced concerns. Some workers reportedly complained that the vessel felt unstable, even during routine operations. Yet little changed. Time after time, the company continued operating. Time after time, opportunities for reform were missed. As public outrage grew, many people began asking the same question: how could so many warning signs have been ignored? The answer seemed to lie in a corporate culture that viewed safety as an expense rather than a responsibility. Every additional vehicle generated revenue. Every extra ton of cargo generated revenue. Every shortcut saved money. The risks were invisible until disaster struck. And when disaster finally did strike, the consequences were catastrophic. For the families of the victims, these discoveries were devastating. The sinking had initially seemed like a tragic accident. The deeper investigators dug, however, the harder it became to view it that way. This wasn't a story about a single mistake. It wasn't one crew member. It wasn't one turn. It wasn't one broken pump. It was years of decisions, years of warnings, years of putting profit ahead of safety. The Sewol had become increasingly unstable, one choice at a time. Additional cargo, reduced ballast water, inadequate training, neglected safety measures, unsafe modifications. Each decision may have seemed small on its own. Together, they created a disaster waiting to happen. And on the morning of April 16, 2014, the bill for those decisions finally came due. The people who paid the price were not the executives, they were not the shareholders, they were not the owners, they were the passengers, many of them just 16 years old. And by the time the ferry began to roll, the conditions that doomed it had already been years in the making. In the immediate aftermath of the Sewol disaster, South Korea mourned. As weeks turned into months, however, mourning gradually gave way to something else: questions. How had a modern passenger ferry been allowed to sink in relatively calm waters? Why had so many passengers remained trapped inside? Why had rescue efforts failed so dramatically? And perhaps most importantly, who was responsible? The public wanted answers, the families demanded them, and investigators soon found themselves examining not just a maritime disaster, but an entire chain of failures, stretching from the ferry itself to the highest levels of government. The most visible target of public anger was Captain Lee Jun-sok. By the time investigators began building their case, the captain had become a symbol of everything that had gone wrong aboard the Sewol. Images of him leaving the vessel while passengers remained trapped inside had already spread across the country. To many people, his actions represented the ultimate betrayal of responsibility. During questioning, Captain Lee attempted to explain his decisions. He argued that he feared passengers might drown if they entered the water without proper rescue equipment nearby. He claimed that the situation was chaotic and that many decisions had been made under extraordinary pressure. Few people were persuaded. Families pointed out the obvious contradiction. If remaining aboard the vessel was truly the safest option, then why had he left? The question followed him throughout the investigation. At trial, prosecutors argued that the captain and senior crew members had failed in their duty to protect passengers. Evidence showed that evacuation orders had not been properly given. Critical opportunities had been missed. Passengers had remained inside the ferry while many crew members escaped. The proceedings attracted enormous public attention. Every statement was scrutinized. Every explanation was dissected. Every attempt to shift blame was met with outrage. Yet the captain was far from the only person under investigation. Numerous crew members also faced criminal charges. Investigators focused particularly on those who had been responsible for passenger safety and emergency communications. Questions were raised about false reports given during the crisis and about crew members who failed to relay life-saving information to those trapped inside the vessel. Some crew members argued that they had simply followed instructions. Others claimed they lacked adequate training. Several pointed toward the company that employed them. And so the circle of blame continued expanding. As attention shifted toward government agencies, investigators began examining the actions of the Coast Guard and other emergency responders. Public confidence in many of these organizations had already been severely damaged by witness accounts, media reports, and testimony from families. The deeper investigators looked, the more troubling questions emerged. Officials had reported rescue activities that witnesses claimed never occurred. Records appeared inconsistent. Timelines failed to match eyewitness accounts. Reports from different agencies often contradicted one another. Then came allegations that would further inflame public outrage. Investigators discovered evidence suggesting that documents and digital records had been altered, deleted, or destroyed following the disaster. One of the most controversial revelations involved surveillance footage. Authorities learned that certain government offices connected to the response had deleted CCTV recordings from the day of the tragedy. For families already struggling to trust official explanations, the discovery was devastating. The footage could have helped establish timelines, verify actions, and clarify who knew what during the critical early hours. Instead, it was gone. Questions immediately followed. Why had it been deleted? Who authorized it? What did the footage show? In many cases, definitive answers never came. The destruction of records fueled growing suspicions that some officials were more concerned with protecting themselves than revealing the truth. Whether that suspicion was entirely justified or not, the damage to public trust was enormous. Investigators also uncovered allegations that various agencies had deleted files, altered reports, or modified records after the disaster. While officials often claimed these actions were routine or unrelated to the investigation, many members of the public found such explanations difficult to accept. To grieving families, it felt as though evidence was disappearing at the very moment accountability was being sought. The investigation soon expanded into one of the largest legal inquiries in modern South Korean history. Crew members, executives, regulators, inspectors, government officials. One by one, individuals connected to the disaster found themselves under scrutiny. The number of arrests steadily grew. Company executives were charged, maritime regulators were charged, government employees faced investigations, inspectors responsible for safety oversight were questioned about how so many warning signs had been missed. What emerged was a picture of systemic failure rather than isolated mistakes. Yet despite the growing list of indictments, accountability remained frustratingly complicated. Everyone seemed to have an explanation. The captain blamed the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard pointed toward the captain. Crew members blamed inadequate training. Executives blamed individual mistakes. Officials blamed poor communication. Agencies blamed one another. The result often resembled a giant circle of finger-pointing, with responsibility constantly being passed from one person to the next. For the families, watching these proceedings was often infuriating. Many felt that the people involved were treating accountability like a game of hot potato. Nobody wanted to be the person left holding responsibility when the music stopped. Yet the victims remained the same. The students were still gone. The teachers were still gone. The passengers were still gone. No amount of blame shifting could change that. As the trials continued, prosecutors secured convictions against numerous individuals connected to the disaster. Arrests eventually extended far beyond the ferry itself, reaching into regulatory bodies and organizations responsible for oversight. More than 100 people would ultimately face legal consequences in some form, and still, many families felt justice remained incomplete. Not because nobody had been punished, but because the tragedy had never belonged to a single individual. The Sewol disaster was the product of countless decisions, missed warnings, and failures of responsibility. Each investigation uncovered another piece of the puzzle, revealing just how many opportunities there had been to prevent what happened. That realization was perhaps the most disturbing finding of all. The ferry did not sink because one person failed. The rescue did not fail because one person hesitated. The disaster became possible because failure existed at every level: corporate, regulatory, operational, political. And as investigators slowly pieced together the truth, one conclusion became impossible to ignore. Everyone seemed to be blaming everyone else, because in one way or another, almost everyone had something to answer for. When people talk about the Sewol Ferry disaster, they often focus on April 16, 2014. They talk about the ferry listing to one side. They talk about the students trapped inside. They talk about the failures of the crew, the confusion of the rescue operation, and the investigations that followed. Those events are important, and they deserve to be remembered. But for many families, the tragedy did not end when the ferry disappeared beneath the water. In many ways, that was only the beginning. Long after the cameras left Jeju Island and the headlines faded from newspapers, hundreds of families were left trying to figure out how to continue living in a world that no longer made sense. Among those struggling with overwhelming guilt was Kang Ming-gyu, the vice principal of Danwon High School. He had accompanied the students on the trip and had survived the sinking. More than 200 of the children he had been responsible for did not. In the days following the disaster, he found himself carrying a burden that no one seemed capable of lifting. Parents were grieving. The nation was grieving. Questions were being asked about who should have done more and who should have acted differently. He could not escape the feeling that he had somehow failed the students entrusted to his care. Only days after the sinking, he was found dead near Jeju Island. Investigators concluded that he had taken his own life. In a note he left behind, he reportedly wrote about his guilt and his inability to face what had happened. He wondered how he could continue living when so many of the students had not. He even expressed a wish that his ashes be scattered near the site where the ferry sank. His death shocked many of the survivors. Students who knew him attended memorial services and spoke about him as a teacher who genuinely cared for his students. Several remembered him as a kind and ethical man who had dedicated his life to education. To them, he was yet another victim of a tragedy that seemed to destroy everyone it touched. Sadly, he would not be the last. As the years passed, the emotional toll of the Sewol disaster continued claiming lives. Several parents who lost children aboard the ferry later took their own lives. Each story carried its own heartbreak, but many shared the same underlying theme. They simply could not find a way to live with the loss. One father died on the first anniversary of the disaster. Others struggled silently with depression, isolation, and overwhelming grief. There are some losses that change a person's life. Then there are losses that completely redefine it. For many Sewol families, life became divided into two chapters, before the ferry and after it. The survivors themselves faced challenges that were often invisible to outsiders. Many of the students who escaped the ferry carried profound survivor guilt. They replayed the events of that day endlessly in their minds. Some questioned why they had lived while friends sitting only a few feet away had died. Others struggled with memories of the classmates they had left behind. Returning to school was particularly painful. Before the disaster, the sophomore class at Danwon High School had been filled with hundreds of students preparing for their futures. When classes eventually resumed, entire sections of the school felt empty. Desks remained vacant. Hallways felt quieter. Every classroom served as a reminder of the friends who would never return. One student later described walking through the school and feeling as though the building itself had changed. Everywhere they looked, memories waited for them. A seat that should have been occupied. A locker that would never open again. A friend who should have been standing beside them. Counselors were brought in to support survivors, but grief is rarely something that can be solved. It lingers, it changes shape. Some days it hides in the background, other days it returns with full force. Many survivors would spend years trying to understand their feelings. For the families of those who died, grief often became woven into everyday life. Bedrooms remained untouched. School uniforms stayed hanging in closets. Books remained on shelves exactly where they had been left. Some parents found comfort in preserving these spaces. Others simply couldn't bring themselves to change anything. The rooms became time capsules, a frozen moment waiting for a child who would never come home. One mother later described lying on her son's bed when she missed him. She would hold his belongings, smell his pillow, and cry. It was one of the few ways she still felt connected to him. Another family explained that they left everything exactly as it had been on the day he left for the school trip. His desk remained untouched. His clothes stayed where he had left them. His room waited for him, even though they knew he would never walk through the door again. For many parents, spring became unbearable. Before the disaster, April had been associated with warmer weather, blooming flowers, and new beginnings. After the Sewol, it became a month of anniversaries and painful memories. Every year, the changing season brought them back to the worst days of their lives. Even families that stayed together often found themselves struggling. Marriages suffered under the weight of grief. Some couples grew closer, others drifted apart. Financial problems emerged. Mental health struggles became common. Relationships that had once seemed unbreakable suddenly found themselves tested in ways nobody had ever imagined. One mother spoke about her husband's nightmares. She described nights when he would wake suddenly, shouting or crying in his sleep. Sometimes he would relive the disaster. Sometimes he would dream about their child. Sometimes he would simply wake overwhelmed by a sadness that words could not adequately describe. She said that grief had changed them both, not because they wanted it to, but because there was no other choice. Perhaps one of the most tragic aspects of the Sewol disaster is that it created thousands of victims, not just the 304 people who lost their lives aboard the ferry. Every parent who lost a child became a victim. Every sibling left behind became a victim. Every survivor who carried guilt became a victim. Every teacher, friend, and family member forced to live with the memories became a victim. The disaster spread outward like ripples across water, touching countless lives far beyond the passengers themselves. Years later, many families still speak about their loved ones in the present tense, not because they are denying reality, but because love does not disappear when someone dies. Parents still celebrate birthdays. They still visit memorials. They still wonder who their children might have become. What career would they have chosen? Who would they have married? Would they have had children of their own? Those questions have no answers. They never will. That is perhaps the cruelest part of all. The Sewol Ferry disaster ended hundreds of lives on a single morning, but for the people left behind, the tragedy never truly ended. It simply became something they learned to carry, day after day, year after year, for the rest of their lives. As the months passed after the Sewol Ferry disaster, grief settled over South Korea like a heavy fog. The immediate shock of the sinking had faded, but the pain remained. Families were still burying loved ones. Some victims were still missing. Investigations were continuing. New revelations about failures, negligence, and incompetence seemed to emerge almost every week. For many people, it felt impossible to move forward because so many questions remained unanswered. The families of the victims did not want the country to move on, not because they wanted to live in grief forever, but because they feared what would happen if people forgot. They had watched officials make promises that were never kept. They had listened to conflicting explanations and shifting narratives. They had seen evidence disappear, records deleted, and responsibility passed from one person to another. Again and again, they found themselves fighting not only for justice, but for something much simpler, the truth. Across South Korea, ordinary citizens began looking for ways to show their support. One symbol quickly emerged above all others: the yellow ribbon. What began as a simple gesture of remembrance soon spread throughout the country. Yellow ribbons appeared on fences, buildings, schools, and public spaces. People tied them to backpacks, jackets, and railings. Businesses displayed them in windows. Students wore them on their uniforms. Entire communities adopted them as a visible promise that the victims would not be forgotten. The yellow ribbon carried a simple message: wait for them, remember them, bring them home. For families still searching for answers, the ribbons became a source of comfort. They were proof that despite the political arguments, despite the investigations, and despite the attempts by some officials to move forward, ordinary people still cared. The movement continued to grow. Public memorials were held across the country. Candlelight vigils filled streets and public squares. Thousands gathered to mourn people they had never met. Many of them had no direct connection to the victims, yet they felt connected by a shared sense of loss. The disaster had become more than a maritime tragedy. It had become a national wound. As public support increased, the families became more determined than ever to demand answers. Many of them felt that investigations were moving too slowly, and that officials were more concerned with protecting institutions than uncovering the truth. In response, some families began staging public demonstrations. They stood outside government buildings. They attended hearings. They confronted lawmakers. They spoke to reporters whenever anyone was willing to listen. Again and again, they repeated the same message. They were not asking for sympathy. They were asking for answers. One of the most powerful forms of protest came through hunger strikes. Several family members chose to stop eating entirely, hoping to draw attention to their demands for a full investigation. The most famous of these involved a father who survived on little more than water and salt for weeks. As the days passed, his health visibly deteriorated. Yet he continued, not because he believed starving himself would bring his child back, but because he felt he had no other way to make people listen. For him, and for many others, the hunger strike was an act of desperation. The families had lost faith that the truth would emerge on its own. They believed they had to force the country to confront what had happened. Images of grieving parents sitting outside government buildings quickly spread across South Korea. Many citizens were deeply moved by their determination. Donations poured in. Volunteers offered support. Strangers traveled long distances simply to stand beside the families and show solidarity. At times, however, the demonstrations also revealed how divided the country had become. Some political supporters accused the families of refusing to move on. Others argued that the tragedy was being used for political purposes. Tensions occasionally boiled over into ugly confrontations. One particularly painful incident occurred when supporters of the government reportedly gathered near protesting families and openly ate meals while the parents continued their hunger strikes. To many observers, the scene felt cruel and deeply disrespectful. Yet the families remained focused on their goal. Again and again, they insisted that they were not demanding money. They were not demanding special treatment. They wanted the truth. One father publicly stated that no amount of compensation could replace a child. Another parent explained that what haunted them most was not only the loss itself, but the feeling that they still did not know exactly why it had happened. For many families, uncertainty became its own form of suffering. The years that followed were filled with memorial events and remembrance ceremonies. Schools created tributes for the students who never returned. Communities organized annual gatherings. Artists, musicians, and writers found ways to honor the victims through their work. The yellow ribbon remained at the center of it all. Over time, it evolved into something larger than a memorial symbol. It became a reminder of accountability, a reminder of unanswered questions, a reminder that citizens have a right to demand honesty from those in power. For some people, the ribbon represented grief. For others, it represented resistance. For many, it represented both. Even as political administrations changed and investigations continued, the symbol endured. Visitors could still find yellow ribbons hanging from fences, tied to trees and displayed at memorial sites years after the disaster. They remained because the story of the Sewol was never only about a ferry. It was about trust. It was about responsibility. It was about what happens when institutions fail the people who depend on them. Most of all, it was about the lives that were lost. The families understood that memories fade with time. News cycles move on. Public attention shifts elsewhere. New tragedies replace old ones in the headlines. That was precisely why they refused to stop speaking, because forgetting was the one thing they could not allow. The yellow ribbons fluttering in the wind across South Korea carried a message that was both simple and powerful. Remember them, demand the truth, and never let this happen again. For as long as those ribbons remained, the country would continue carrying the memory of the students, teachers, and passengers who boarded a ferry expecting to arrive at Jeju Island and never came home. And in that way, despite everything that had happened, they would not be forgotten. As the investigations continued and the nation grappled with the aftermath of the disaster, one painful reality remained unchanged. Not everyone had been brought home. Months after the Sewol sank beneath the waters of the Mongol Channel, families were still waiting for answers. Most of the victims had been recovered, identified, and laid to rest, but several passengers remained missing. Their families existed in a cruel state of limbo, unable to fully grieve because there was still hope, however small, that their loved ones might somehow be found. For those families, the Sewol itself became impossible to ignore. Somewhere beneath the surface, resting on the seabed, was the ferry that had carried their children, spouses, parents, and friends. It was also a place where evidence remained trapped, questions remained trapped, and for some families, their loved ones remained trapped as well. Almost immediately after the sinking, relatives began calling for the vessel to be salvaged. To them, the reasoning seemed obvious. The ferry was a crime scene. The ferry contained evidence. The ferry might still hold victims. The ferry needed to be raised. What followed would become another source of frustration and anger. Again and again, officials explained that salvaging the vessel was extraordinarily complicated. The operation would be difficult, expensive, and dangerous. Experts would need to be consulted. Studies would need to be conducted. Technical evaluations would need to be completed. The government insisted that every possible factor had to be carefully considered before any attempt could be made. For grieving families, those explanations quickly began to sound familiar. They had heard similar language during the rescue operation. More studies, more evaluations, more waiting, more delays. As months passed with little visible progress, many families began questioning whether the delays were truly about technical challenges or whether something else was happening. Some suspected that authorities were reluctant to raise the ferry because of what it might reveal. The seawall was more than a sunken vessel. It was evidence. Every room, every hallway, and every damaged compartment potentially held answers. Investigators could learn more about how passengers had spent their final moments. They could examine escape routes. They could identify structural failures. They could determine whether previous explanations matched the physical evidence inside the wreck. For families who already distrusted official accounts, the delays felt suspicious. Public pressure continued to grow. As the months stretched into years, parents organized demonstrations and continued demanding action. Some staged protests outside government buildings. Others participated in hunger strikes. Their message remained remarkably consistent. They were not asking for money. They were not asking for favors. They simply wanted their loved ones brought home. The longer the ferry remained underwater, the more painful the uncertainty became. Many families spoke about feeling trapped between hope and despair. They knew the chances of finding survivors were long gone, yet they still wanted the opportunity to recover remains, hold funerals, and say goodbye properly. Without that closure, many felt unable to move forward. At times, it seemed as though the families were fighting two battles at once. One battle was against grief. The other was against bureaucracy. Meanwhile, reports emerged suggesting that salvage proposals had existed far earlier than many people realized. Several private companies reportedly submitted plans outlining ways the ferry could potentially be recovered. Some proposals were submitted within months of the disaster. Yet despite the existence of these options, little happened. The delays continued. Every announcement seemed to bring another reason why action could not yet be taken. Technical concerns, financial concerns, safety concerns, procedural concerns. For the families, those explanations became increasingly difficult to accept. Eventually, after years of debate, planning, and public pressure, the decision was finally made. The Sewol would be raised. The operation itself was enormously complex. Engineers had to work carefully to avoid causing additional damage to the wreck. Every movement carried risks. Evidence needed to be preserved. Human remains might still be inside. The vessel had spent years underwater, exposed to currents, corrosion, and the immense pressure of the sea. The recovery operation became a symbol of the determination that families had shown from the very beginning. They had refused to let the story disappear. They had refused to stop asking questions. And now, after years of fighting, they were finally watching the ferry emerge from the water. When the Sewol was eventually lifted from the seabed, many families gathered to witness the moment. For some, it felt like seeing a loved one again. For others, it felt like reopening a wound that had never fully healed. The rust-covered hull that emerged from the sea was almost unrecognizable compared to the vessel that had left Incheon carrying excited students years earlier. Yet for many parents, it remained the last place their children had been alive. The sight was heartbreaking, but it was also necessary. As investigators searched the wreck, additional remains were discovered, allowing some families to finally bring loved ones home. Each discovery was accompanied by a mixture of grief and relief. No parent wanted to receive that news, yet many had spent years praying for exactly that outcome. At least now they could know. At least now they could say goodbye. Even after the salvage operation, however, not every question was answered. Some victims remained missing. Some mysteries remained unresolved. Some families continued waiting. Yet the raising of the Sewol represented something larger than a recovery effort. It represented persistence. The ferry had spent years hidden beneath the sea, but the families never stopped fighting for it to be brought back into the light. They refused to allow their loved ones to be forgotten beneath layers of bureaucracy, politics, and time. Again and again, they demanded truth. Again and again, they demanded accountability. Again and again, they demanded that everyone be brought home. The salvage of the Sewol could not undo what had happened on April 16, 2014. It could not return the students who never came home. It could not erase the failures that led to the disaster. But for many families, it represented a promise finally being honored. A promise that the search would continue. A promise that the victims would not be abandoned. And a promise that even after years of waiting, the fight to bring them home was not over. Because for the families of the Sewol, the disaster was never simply about a ship resting at the bottom of the sea. It was about the people who were still waiting to come home. As the years passed, following the Sewol Ferry disaster, courtrooms across South Korea became the latest battleground in the fight for answers. Investigations had uncovered negligence, corruption, regulatory failures, and a rescue operation that many families believed had failed at every critical moment. Executives had been arrested, government officials had been questioned, crew members had been charged. Yet despite the growing list of indictments and investigations, many families found themselves wrestling with a difficult question. What would justice even look like? No court ruling could bring back a child. No prison sentence could undo a final text message. No verdict could erase the memories of parents standing on Jeju Island, waiting for children who would never return. Still, accountability mattered. For many families, the courtroom represented one of the few remaining places where the truth could be formally examined and responsibility assigned. The most closely watched trial was that of Captain Lee Jung-sok. By the time he appeared in court, he had become one of the most recognizable faces associated with the disaster. To many South Koreans, he embodied the failures that had unfolded aboard the Sewol. Images of him leaving the vessel while hundreds of passengers remained trapped inside had already become etched into the nation's memory. Throughout the proceedings, the captain attempted to explain his actions. He argued that he believed remaining aboard the ferry was safer for passengers than entering the water. He claimed that rescue operations would soon arrive and that he never intended for people to die. At times, he expressed remorse. At other times, critics felt he was attempting to shift blame toward rescue agencies and other officials. For the families sitting in the courtroom, those explanations often rang hollow. The evidence painted a devastating picture. Passengers had been repeatedly instructed to remain where they were. Critical evacuation orders had not been properly given. Crew members had escaped, while students and passengers waited below decks. Opportunities to save lives had been missed again and again. Initially, prosecutors pursued some of the most serious charges available, arguing that the captain's actions had directly contributed to the deaths of those trapped aboard the ferry. The legal battles that followed were lengthy and complex, with appeals and challenges continuing for years. Ultimately, Captain Lee was sentenced to decades in prison. For some families, the sentence brought a measure of closure. For others, it changed nothing. No number attached to a prison sentence could equal 304 lives. The captain was not alone. Numerous crew members were also convicted for their roles in the disaster. Some were found guilty of abandoning passengers. Others were convicted for failing to carry out responsibilities that might have helped save lives. Several received prison terms, while others faced lesser punishments. Beyond the crew, investigators continued examining the company that owned the Sewol. Executives and officials connected to Chonghaejin Marine faced charges related to negligence, safety violations, and regulatory failures. Maritime inspectors and regulators were scrutinized for allowing dangerous practices to continue unchecked. The legal net widened until it became clear that responsibility extended far beyond the bridge of the ferry. The disaster had not been created by a single decision. It had been built through years of shortcuts, ignored warnings, and failures at multiple levels. Meanwhile, public attention increasingly turned toward the Coast Guard and government agencies that had overseen the rescue effort. Investigations revealed troubling details about the response. Reports were questioned, records were examined. Deleted files and missing documentation raised further concerns about transparency. Public confidence in many institutions had already been damaged during the rescue operation. The investigations only deepened that distrust. The Coast Guard faced intense criticism, and in the years that followed, significant restructuring was announced. Political leaders promised reforms, agencies were reorganized, new systems were proposed to improve future emergency responses. Whether those changes were enough remained a matter of debate. For many families, reforms were welcome, but they did not answer the deeper question of why so many failures had been allowed to happen in the first place. The political consequences of the Sewol disaster extended all the way to the Blue House. President Park Geun-hye's handling of the tragedy remained a source of controversy long after the ferry sank. Questions about her actions during the critical early hours of the disaster never fully disappeared. Public frustration over transparency, accountability, and leadership continued growing throughout her presidency. While her eventual impeachment involved a wider corruption scandal unrelated to the Sewol alone, many observers noted that the disaster had profoundly damaged public trust in her administration. For countless South Koreans, Sewol became a symbol of governmental failure, and that perception followed her throughout the remainder of her time in office. The political fallout would continue for years. The emotional fallout would continue even longer. Compensation was eventually offered to the families of victims. Financial settlements were arranged, and various support programs were created. Yet many relatives expressed discomfort whenever compensation became the focus of public discussion. Again and again, families emphasized that they had never been fighting for money. They wanted answers. They wanted accountability. They wanted the truth. No payment could replace a son, daughter, husband, wife, or parent. No check could fill an empty bedroom. No settlement could undo the silence left behind after a final phone call. For many families, accepting compensation felt less like justice and more like paperwork. It was necessary, perhaps, but it was not what they had spent years demanding. As convictions accumulated and investigations concluded, the country slowly moved into a new phase of remembrance. The courtroom battles were ending. The appeals were winding down. Reports had been written. Sentences had been handed down. Yet a lingering question remained. Had justice actually been achieved? The answer depended on who you asked. Some believed the courts had done everything they could. People had been investigated. Wrongdoers had been punished. Reforms had been implemented. Accountability, imperfect as it was, had been pursued. Others felt differently. They looked at the scale of the tragedy and struggled to reconcile it with any legal outcome. 304 lives had been lost. Entire families had been shattered. Survivors would carry the memories forever. How could any courtroom ever balance those scales? Perhaps that is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of every tragedy. Justice can punish wrongdoing. Justice can expose failures. Justice can establish facts. But justice cannot turn back time. It cannot return the students who boarded the Sewol believing they were heading toward a school trip and a few days of adventure on Jeju Island. And it cannot give families back the futures they lost. By the end of the legal proceedings, many people had been convicted. Careers had ended. Governments had changed. Institutions had been reformed. Accountability, at least on paper, had been pursued. Yet for the families of the Sewol, the question remained as painful as ever. Not whether justice had been served, but whether justice could ever be enough. In the years that followed the Sewol Ferry disaster, South Korea slowly began the difficult process of moving forward. The key word, however, was moving forward, not moving on. For many people, there was a significant difference between the two. Moving on implied forgetting. Moving forward meant carrying the memory with you. The country would spend years learning how to do exactly that. One of the first and most visible reminders of the tragedy could be found at Danwon High School. When surviving students eventually returned to class, they stepped into a world that no longer felt familiar. Before the disaster, the school had been filled with hundreds of teenagers planning their futures, worrying about exams, laughing with friends, and looking forward to graduation. Now entire sections of the school felt painfully empty. Rows of desks sat vacant. Classrooms felt quieter. Hallways carried an absence that was impossible to ignore. Every surviving student knew someone who had died. Every teacher carried memories of students who would never return. Counselors were brought in to support those struggling with grief, trauma, and survivor's guilt, but healing was never going to be simple. Many students later spoke about the strange feeling of continuing to grow older while their friends remained forever 16. Graduations came and went. Birthdays passed. Careers began. Families were started. Yet for those left behind, part of them remained aboard the Sewol. The impact of the tragedy extended far beyond the school itself. Across South Korea, memorials began appearing in cities, towns, and communities. Some were large public monuments. Others were small collections of flowers, photographs, and yellow ribbons left by strangers. Together they became places where people could gather, reflect, and remember. Every year, anniversary ceremonies continued drawing visitors from across the country. Parents, survivors, students, and ordinary citizens came together to honor the victims. Many of them had never personally known anyone aboard the ferry, yet they felt connected to the tragedy all the same. The Sewol disaster had become something larger than an accident. It had become a national memory. The yellow ribbon remained one of the most enduring symbols of that memory. What had started as a simple expression of hope evolved into a symbol recognized throughout South Korea. The ribbon represented remembrance, accountability, and a refusal to let the victims be forgotten. Years after the disaster, yellow ribbons could still be found hanging from fences, displayed in shop windows, and worn by people who felt the country still owed the victims answers. For many families, seeing those ribbons brought comfort. It meant people still remembered. It meant their children had not been reduced to statistics. It meant their stories were still being told. The cultural impact of the tragedy reached nearly every corner of South Korean society. Television programs paused broadcasts during periods of mourning. Public events were canceled. Festivals were postponed. For a time, it felt as though the entire country had collectively stopped to grieve. Perhaps nowhere was that grief more visible than within South Korea's music industry. K-pop is often associated with bright performances, elaborate productions, and constant activity. But following the Sewol disaster, much of the industry came to a standstill. Numerous artists delayed album releases, postponed promotions, and canceled appearances out of respect for the victims and their families. It was an unusual moment of unity. Competition disappeared. Business slowed. For a brief period, mourning took priority over everything else. As the years passed, artists continued finding ways to honor the memory of those lost. One of the most famous examples came from BTS. In 2017, the group released a song called Spring Day. Although the members have never explicitly described it as a Sewol song, many listeners immediately connected its themes of grief, longing, and separation to the disaster. The lyrics spoke about missing someone who was gone, waiting through long winters, and hoping to be reunited again someday. For countless families and survivors, the song resonated deeply. Many people continue to associate it with the Sewol tragedy to this day. The song became one of the most enduring musical tributes linked to the disaster, helping introduce the memory of Sewol to younger generations who may have been children themselves when the ferry sank. Other artists also paid tribute. Some wore yellow ribbons during performances, others dedicated songs, concerts, or public appearances to the victims. One particularly moving tribute came when singer Lee Sung-hwan completed and performed a song written by a student who had died aboard the ferry. The teenager had dreamed of becoming a musician himself. Through that performance, a small part of that dream lived on. These acts of remembrance mattered, not because they could undo the tragedy, but because they ensured the victims would not disappear from public memory. The legacy of Sewol also extended into politics, education, and emergency preparedness. New discussions emerged about safety regulations, disaster response systems, and government accountability. Schools began placing greater emphasis on emergency training. Citizens became more willing to question official narratives and demand transparency from public institutions. In many ways, Sewol changed how South Korea viewed authority. Before the disaster, many people assumed that institutions would function when needed most. After Sewol, that trust was no longer automatic. Trust became something that had to be earned. The disaster also left behind a generation shaped by its memory. For many young South Koreans, Sewol was their defining national tragedy. They grew up watching the investigations, the protests, the memorials, and the continued search for answers. The lessons of the disaster became part of their understanding of responsibility, accountability, and citizenship. Even today, years later, the names of the victims continue to be read at memorial events. Families continue gathering, yellow ribbons continue fluttering in the wind, and the story continues being told, because remembrance is not simply about looking backward. It is about carrying the past into the future. The Sewol Ferry disaster changed countless lives on a single spring morning. It exposed failures, it revealed corruption, it shattered families, but it also created something else. A collective promise. A promise that the students, teachers, and passengers who boarded that ferry would never simply become a chapter in a history book. A promise that their lives would be remembered. A promise that future generations would know their names, and a promise that no matter how much time passes, South Korea will never forget the lessons written in the cold waters of the Mangol Channel. Because some tragedies become part of a nation's history, the Sewol became part of its heart. More than a decade has passed since the Sewol Ferry disappeared beneath the waters of the Mangol Channel. The sea that morning looked ordinary. The students who boarded the ferry looked ordinary. The parents waving goodbye looked ordinary. There was nothing to suggest that April 16th, 2014, would become one of the darkest days in modern South Korean history. Yet even now, years later, the effects of that day can still be felt. Some wounds never fully heal, some questions never completely fade, and some names are simply too important to forget. Today, memorials stand across South Korea in honor of the 304 people who lost their lives aboard the Sewol. Visitors leave flowers, letters, and yellow ribbons. Parents still visit the places dedicated to their children. Survivors still speak about classmates they miss. Teachers are still remembered. Volunteers are still remembered. Even now, anniversary ceremonies draw people from across the country who feel a responsibility to ensure that what happened aboard the ferry is never reduced to a footnote in history. Because the story of the Sewol was never just about a ship. It was about trust. The trust children place in adults, the trust passengers place in a captain, the trust citizens place in institutions, and what happens when that trust is broken. For many families, the hardest part has always been imagining the final moments aboard the ferry. The students did exactly what they had been taught to do. They listened to authority figures. They followed instructions. They trusted that the adults around them knew what was best. Again and again, they were told to stay where they were. Again and again, they obeyed. Many never got the chance to make another decision. Among those students were the two boys whose story opened this video. Years after the sinking, a diver would describe finding them beneath the water. Their life jackets had been tied together. The diver later said separating them was one of the hardest things he had ever done. In many ways, their story became a symbol of everything the Sewol tragedy represents. Not politics, not corruption, not investigations. Human beings, children, people who deserve to come home. The years since the disaster have brought trials, convictions, reforms, and memorials. Governments have changed. Officials have come and gone. New laws have been written. Yet for many families, the pain remains remarkably unchanged. Some still keep their children's bedrooms exactly as they were. Some still celebrate birthdays. Some still visit memorial sites and speak to photographs. Some still wake up each morning carrying the same questions they carried in 2014. What if someone had acted sooner? What if the passengers had been told to evacuate? What if rescue efforts had been coordinated? What if somebody had simply done their job? Those questions will never have satisfying answers. Perhaps that is why the Sewol continues to resonate so deeply. It forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Disasters are not always unavoidable. Sometimes they are built through complacency, through negligence, through indifference, through people assuming someone else will take responsibility. The legacy of the Sewol is not simply remembering those who died. It is remembering why they died. It is remembering the cost of looking away. It is remembering the consequences of valuing reputation over responsibility, procedure over action, and profit over people. Most of all, it is remembering the children. The students who boarded a ferry, expecting to spend a few days with friends on Jeju Island. The students who texted their parents that they loved them. The students who trusted the adults around them. The students who never came home. Even today, 5 victims remain missing. For some families, there is still no grave to visit, no final goodbye. Only absence, only waiting, only hope. And perhaps that is why the yellow ribbons still flutter in the wind across South Korea. Because remembrance is not just about honoring the past. It is about protecting the future. It is about making a promise that these lives mattered, a promise that these names will not be forgotten, and a promise that future generations will know what happened here. People always ask why the children weren't saved. One family member gave an answer that still haunts South Korea today. Above all else, they simply had no desire to protect the children. Golden time came and went, and all they did was lie. And that is where this long and heartbreaking story comes to an end. If you made it this far, thank you for sticking with it. And as always, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story informative, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It really helps support Midnight Murder and Mystery and allows me to continue bringing these stories to you. Thank you for spending part of your evening with me. Until next time, stay safe, sleep well, and remember the truth always comes out in the dark.